The wind in Wyoming did not just blow, it scoured. It was a living, malevolent force that sought to strip the bark from the sagebrush and the hope from a man's soul. In the late summer of 1884, the sky over the Laramie Plains looked like hammered tin, hard and gray and pressing down on the earth with a suffocating weight. There was no moisture in the air, only the grit of alkali dust that found its way into every seam of clothing and every line of a man's face. Caleb Morgan stood near the remnants of his south corral, a heavy sledgehammer resting against his thigh. He was a man built of the same hard materials as the landscape, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by 35 years of high-altitude sun and wind. His shirt was stained with sweat and soil, clinging to a back that ached with a dull, familiar throb. He looked at the split fence post in front of him, the wood gray and splintered like an old bone. He lifted the hammer and brought it down. The impact jarred his arms all the way to the shoulders. He swung again, and again. It was a rhythmic violence, a way to speak to a world that refused to listen. His hands were a map of his struggles. The calluses were thick, but the dryness of the season had cracked the skin across his knuckles, and fresh blood welled up in the fissures, mixing with the dust. He did not wipe it away. Pain was the only thing that felt real lately. The drought had taken 20 head of cattle in the last month alone, their ribs showing through their hides like the staves of a barrel before they finally collapsed near the dried-up creek bed. Then the spring storm had come, a sudden, violent burst of hail and floodwater that had not saved the grass but had washed away 50 yards of fencing, leaving his remaining herd vulnerable to the open range. Caleb set the hammer down and wiped his forehead with his forearm. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of a silver locket. He did not pull it out. He did not need to look at it to see the face inside. Hannah. It had been 3 years. 3 years since the silence had descended on the ranch house, thick and heavy. She had died in the bed they shared, struggling to bring a life into the world that had flickered out alongside her own. The baby, a boy, had never drawn a breath. Caleb had buried them together on the rise overlooking the house, under a cottonwood tree that was now struggling to keep its leaves. He still slept on the left side of the bed. The right side remained made, the quilt smooth and undisturbed, a shrine to a ghost he could not exorcise. He walked through his days like a man wading through deep water, the pressure constant, the movement slow. The sound of wheels crunching on gravel broke his trance. Caleb squinted against the glare. A black buggy was making its way up the rutted track that led from the main road. The horse was well fed, its coat gleaming with a sheen that spoke of grain and stables, a stark contrast to Caleb's own rib-thin mounts. Caleb watched the buggy stop. Mr. Grady, the banker from Dry Creek, did not immediately step down. He sat on the padded leather seat, adjusting his spectacles, looking at the dilapidated corral and the gaunt rancher with an expression of mild distaste. "Good afternoon, Caleb," Grady said. His voice was dry, like rustling paper. Caleb nodded once. "Mr. Grady, I trust you know why I've driven out here," Grady said, finally climbing down. He dusted off his trousers, though there was no dust on them. Caleb leaned the handle of the sledgehammer against his hip. "I have a calendar. Grady, I know the date." "Then you know the payment on the note is 2 months overdue," Grady said. He walked to the fence, testing a post with a gloved hand. It wobbled. He made a small, disapproving sound. "The bank has been patient. Caleb, we have made allowances for your loss, but the directors in Cheyenne are looking at the ledgers. This drought has reduced the value of the land significantly. I will have the money when I sell off the herd in the fall," Caleb said, his voice rough. Grady turned, his eyes hard behind the glass lenses. "The herd is thin, Caleb, and the market is flooded. Everyone is selling. The price of beef has dropped to 3 cents a pound. Even if you sell every head you have, the math does not favor you." "I will find a way," Caleb said. He tightened his grip on the hammer handle. Grady sighed, a sound that feigned sympathy but held none. "There are investors, Caleb, men connected to the railroad. They are looking for land in this territory, not for the grass, but for the water rights. They pay cash. If you cannot clear the debt of $2,000 before the first snow falls, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. We will sell the deed to satisfy the loan. $2,000. It might as well have been $2 million. This is my land, Caleb said quietly. My wife is buried on that hill. Grady climbed back into his buggy, gathering the reins. Sentiment does not pay the interest. Caleb, I suggest you look at this practically. You are one man trying to hold back the tide. It is time to let go. Caleb watched him ride away, the buggy disappearing into the heat shimmer. He stood alone in the silence, the wind hissing through the sagebrush, whispering the word failure over and over again. 5 miles east, in the town of Dry Creek, the daily stagecoach from the railhead rattled down the main street. Dry Creek was a settlement that had grown like a tumor on the side of the cattle trail, a collection of false-fronted buildings, 2 saloons, a general mercantile, and a pervasive smell of horse manure and stale beer. The stagecoach driver hauled back on the reins, the brake lever screeching as the heavy vehicle shuddered to a halt in front of the Hotel Imperial, a name that promised a grandeur the 2-story wooden structure did not possess. The door swung open, and a boot stepped out. It was not the scuffed, spur-scarred boot of a cowboy, nor the sturdy, flat-heeled boot of a ranch wife. It was fine leather, black and polished, with a delicate heel and intricate stitching. It touched the mud of the street with hesitation. Eleanor Nora Whitfield stepped down into the dust of Dry Creek. The town seemed to pause. A group of men loitering on the boardwalk stopped their conversation. A woman sweeping the porch of the mercantile leaned on her broom, eyes narrowing. Nora stood out like a diamond in a coal bucket. She was dressed in a traveling suit of dark blue silk, covered by a dust coat that had seen better days but was still of higher quality than anything available within 300 miles. A hat with a delicate veil shaded her face, protecting her pale skin from the harsh glare. She held a leather valise, her gloved knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She was 27 years old, with dark hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of a stormy sea, intelligent and watchful. But beneath the poise of her posture, there was a tremor of exhaustion. She had been traveling for 6 days from Boston, shifting from train to coach, moving further and further from the life she understood into this vast, uncivilized openness. A man spat tobacco juice into the dirt a few feet away. Nora did not flinch, though her stomach turned. She signaled to the driver to unload her trunk. "Is this all of it, ma'am?" the driver asked, tossing a heavy wooden trunk onto the boardwalk with a thud. "Yes, thank you," Nora said. Her voice was clear, carrying the clipped, refined accent of the East Coast. It sounded alien in the thick, lazy air of the town. She walked into the hotel, feeling the eyes of the town on her back. Men smirked, undressing her with their eyes, while women whispered behind their hands. She heard the words Eastern and Princess and Lost floating in the air. Inside the hotel lobby, which smelled of lemon oil and old cigars, she approached the clerk. He was a balding man with ink-stained fingers who looked up at her over the rim of his spectacles. "I have a reservation," she said. "Eleanor Whitfield." The clerk paused, his eyebrows shooting up. "Whitfield? Related to Mr. Charles Whitfield?" "He is my father," Nora said simply. The clerk's demeanor changed instantly. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his hands on his apron. "My apologies. Miss Whitfield, we were expecting you. Of course. We have the best room ready. Top of the stairs, corner facing the street. It catches the breeze." "Thank you," Nora said. Has there been any word from Mr. Victor Harrow?" She hated the way her voice thinned when she said the name. It felt like a wire tightening around her throat. The clerk nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Harrow sent a telegram yesterday. He is delayed in Denver on railroad business but expects to arrive within the week. He left instructions for your comfort." "Of course he did," Nora thought bitterly. Victor left instructions for everything. She took the key and followed a boy carrying her trunk up the narrow stairs. The room was small but clean, with flowered wallpaper peeling slightly at the corners and a wash basin on a stand. Once the boy had gone. Nora locked the door and leaned against it. Closing her eyes, she breathed in, counting to 10, trying to slow the racing of her heart. She walked to the window and looked out at the dusty street below. The town was ugly, raw, and violent. It was exactly the kind of place Victor Harrow thrived in. She began to unbutton her dust coat. As she washed the grit from her face and hands, her reflection in the small mirror caught her eye. She looked composed. She looked like the obedient daughter of a tycoon. She rolled up the sleeve of her silk blouse. There, on the delicate skin of her wrist, were faint, yellowish bruises. They were fading, but they were still there. She closed her eyes, and the memory washed over her, cold and sharp. The gala in Boston. 2 weeks ago, the clinking of crystal glasses, the murmur of polite society. She had made a comment, a small, witty remark about one of her father's business rivals that had made the table laugh. Victor had smiled, his hand resting on her arm, but later, in the carriage, the smile had vanished. "You must learn to hold your tongue." "Eleanor," he had whispered, his voice smooth as velvet. His hand had clamped around her wrist, his thumb pressing into the tendon, grinding against the bone. "You are to be my wife. You will reflect my judgment, not your own foolishness." He had squeezed until she gasped, tears springing to her eyes. He hadn't let go until they reached her father's house, and when she had shown the bruises to her father the next morning, begging to break the engagement. Charles Whitfield had barely looked up from his newspaper. "Victor is a strong man. Eleanor," her father had said, "he builds empires. He needs a wife who understands discipline. You will do your duty. This merger secures the family legacy. Do not be dramatic. Trapped." She was wealthy, educated, and completely owned. She had been shipped west like a crate of machinery to be delivered to its new owner. Nora pulled her sleeve down, covering the marks. She was in a strange land, surrounded by strangers, waiting for the jailer to arrive with the key. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The wind did not die down. It merely changed its tune, whistling through the gaps in the buildings. Caleb rode into town as the lamps were being lit. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside the Rusty Spur Saloon. He didn't have money for whiskey, but he needed to speak to the stable master who drank there, to see if he could trade labor for a few sacks of grain. His own feed was gone, and the horses were suffering. He pushed through the bat-wing doors. The saloon was crowded, a haze of tobacco smoke hanging in the air. A piano player was hammering out a tune in the corner, competing with the roar of laughter and the clatter of poker chips. Caleb moved to the end of the bar, keeping his head down. He ordered a coffee, the cheapest thing on the menu, and waited. He felt the familiar weight of isolation. He had grown up in this territory, but grief had made him a stranger. Men nodded to him, but few spoke. Misfortune was contagious, or so they believed. The doors opened again, and a hush rippled through the room. Nora stood in the entrance. She had changed into a simpler dress, though still far too fine for the setting, and had thrown a shawl over her shoulders. She looked out of place, a swan in a pigsty. She was looking for the hotel owner, who she had been told could be found here, to ask about sending a letter. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed the man at the end of the bar, Caleb. He was dusty, his shirt stained, his hat pulled low, but he was big. He took up space not with bluster, but with a quiet solidity. The crowd seemed to unconsciously give him room. She took a step forward, and a cowboy near the door, swaying on his heels, grinned. He smelled of sour mash and unwashed body. "Well now," he slurred, stepping into her path. "Look what the wind blew in. Fresh eastern stock. You looking for a guide, sweetheart? I know all the trails." Nora stiffened, clutching her shawl. "Please let me pass." The cowboy laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He reached out a hand, his dirty fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve. "Don't be high and mighty. You're in Dry Creek now. We're all friendly here." The piano stopped. The room went quiet. Violence in the west was like a sudden storm. You could feel the pressure drop before the lightning struck. Caleb turned slowly from the bar. He set his coffee cup down. It made a sharp click on the wood. "Let her be." Heavy silence carried Caleb's voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whip. The cowboy turned, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. He squinted at Caleb. "This ain't your business. Morgan, go back to your dying cows." Caleb didn't move his hand toward a weapon. He just stood there, his eyes flat and tired. He looked like a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "I said, let her be," Caleb repeated. The cowboy hesitated. He looked at Caleb's size, at the heavy, scarred hands hanging loose at his sides. The drunk courage flickered and died. He spat on the floor, muttered a curse, and stepped back. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Caleb. He didn't look at her. He turned back to his coffee. His shoulders hunched slightly, as if he expected a blow. She realized with a jolt that he hadn't done it for her gratitude. He had done it because it was right, and he was too weary to care about the consequences. "Thank you," she said softly to his back. Caleb didn't turn. "Best you get back to the hotel, ma'am. This isn't a place for you." Nora hesitated, then turned and walked out, her heart pounding. She had seen something in the set of his shoulders, in the rough rasp of his voice, a kind of broken dignity that she recognized, because she felt it in herself. The next morning, the sky was a deceptive, brilliant blue. Nora, feeling the walls of the hotel closing in on her, hired a driver and a buggy. She told the clerk she wanted to see the countryside, to appreciate the land her father invested in. In truth, she just needed to be where there were no eyes watching her, no whispers, no telegraphs from Victor. They rode west, away from the town. The landscape was vast and terrifyingly empty. It made Nora feel small, which was strangely comforting. About 5 miles out, the road dipped into a dry wash. The driver, a young boy with more confidence than skill, took the slope too fast. The front wheel struck a hidden rock with a bone-jarring crack. The buggy lurched violently. Tilting to the side, the horse reared, tangled in the traces, and the vehicle settled into the sand. The axle jammed hard against a boulder. Nora was thrown against the side of the seat but was unhurt. The driver jumped down, cursing, and kicked the wheel. "It's stuck tight, ma'am," he said, his face pale. "The axle might be bent. I can't move it alone." "Go," Nora said, adjusting her hat. "Walk back to the nearest ranch or to town. Get help. I can't leave you here." "Miss Whitfield, I will be fine," she said, her voice firm. "I have water. I will sit in the shade of the buggy. Go." The boy ran off back toward town. Nora sat on the tilted seat, looking out at the endless brown waves of grass. The silence was absolute. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The sun began to beat down, the heat rising in shimmering waves. She saw a rider approaching from the north. He was riding the fence line, stopping every so often to check the wire. As he got closer, she recognized the battered hat and the broad shoulders. It was the man from the saloon, Caleb Morgan. He saw the buggy and spurred his horse into a trot. He pulled up a few yards away, the dust swirling around his horse's hooves. He looked at the stuck wheel, then at Nora. "Your driver leave you?" he asked. "He went for help," Nora said. She felt foolish, sitting there in her fine clothes in the middle of nowhere. Caleb dismounted. He tied his horse to a scrub bush and walked over to the buggy. He inspected the axle, running his hand along the wood. "It's not broken, just wedged, but it needs lifting." He took a coil of rope from his saddle and tied it to the rear of the buggy, then looped it around a sturdy mesquite root to act as an anchor. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with white scars. "Step down, ma'am," he said. Nora climbed down, her boots sinking into the soft sand. She watched him. He positioned his shoulder under the carriage frame, planting his feet wide. "When I lift, you throw a rock under the wheel," he said, nodding to a flat stone nearby. Nora blinked. "Me? I don't see anyone else," he grunted. She hesitated, then picked up the heavy stone. Her silk gloves were instantly stained. "Ready?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and shoved upward. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. The heavy buggy groaned and lifted a few inches. Nora saw the sweat streak down his temple, saw the sheer, brute power required to hold the weight. "Now!" he yelled. She shoved the rock under the wheel. He lowered the carriage onto it, the wheel now clear of the boulder. He stepped back, chest heaving, wiping his face with his sleeve. Nora stared at him. She was used to men in suits who paid other men to do heavy lifting. Victor had soft hands. This man was raw force. "Thank you," she said, breathless. Caleb checked the wheel. "It'll hold to get you back to town. You shouldn't be out here alone. I needed air," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Up close, he saw the tension around her eyes, the fear she tried to hide behind good manners. "You're the Whitfield girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you are Caleb Morgan," she replied. "The town gossips are very thorough. They say you are a widower, and that the bank is coming for you." Caleb stiffened. His pride flared hot and sudden. "They talk too much. They say my father's company wants your water," she added, compelled by a sudden need for honesty. Caleb looked at the horizon. The clouds were gathering in the west, dark and bruising. "Is that why you're here, to survey the acquisition?" "No," Nora said. "Hurt. I have nothing to do with my father's business. I am here to wait for my fiancé, Victor Harrow." Caleb laughed. A short, bitter sound. "Harrow, the man who breaks things so your father can buy them cheap." Nora flinched. "He is a difficult man." Caleb looked at her, seeing the way she hugged her elbows, the way her eyes darkened at the mention of Harrow's name. He felt a strange pang in his chest, resentment mixed with something else. She was the enemy. She represented the money that was strangling him, and yet, standing there in the dust, she looked like a trapped animal. And he was just a man with bleeding hands and an empty bed. But as she looked at him, he saw a flash of hunger in her eyes, not for him, specifically, but for the freedom he possessed, the freedom to stand on his own dirt and sweat. "You should get moving," Caleb said roughly. "Storm's coming." He pointed to the west. The sky had turned a sickly shade of green. A wall of dust was rising from the earth, blotting out the mountains. It was moving fast. "That's not rain," Caleb said. "Dust storm. You won't make it to town." "What do I do?" Nora asked, panic rising in her voice. "My place is a mile back," Caleb said. "We have to ride. Now!" He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed her by the waist. His hands were large, warm, and firm, and hoisted her onto his horse. He swung up behind her. The contact was shocking. Her back pressed against his chest. His arms came around her to grab the reins. She could smell him, sweat, leather, and sage. It was the scent of the land. "Hold on," he shouted over the rising wind. They rode hard. The wind hit them before they reached the ranch, a screaming gale that threw sand into their eyes and mouths. The world turned into a brown blur. Nora buried her face in the rough wool of Caleb's shirt, terrified. He was a solid anchor in the chaos. They reached the ranch house just as visibility dropped to zero. Caleb slid off and pulled her down, shielding her body with his own as they stumbled onto the porch and through the door. He kicked the door shut and dropped the latch. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, though the cabin shook with the force of it. Nora coughed, brushing dust from her dress. The cabin was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the small windows. It was simple. A rough table, a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed in the corner. Caleb moved to the stove and poured water from a bucket into a coffee pot. He lit a match, the flare illuminating his face. He looked tired. "It'll pass in a few hours," he said. "Sit." Nora sat at the scarred wooden table. There were 2 chairs. She took one. She looked at the other chair. It was pushed in, dustless, but there was a stillness around it. She looked at the bed. One pillow was indented. The other was fluffy and high. The quilt pulled up tight. "You live alone," she said softly. Caleb put a tin cup of black coffee in front of her. His hand brushed hers. A spark jumped between them. Static electricity from the dry air, but it felt like more. I do now, he said. He sat opposite her. The storm howled outside, a living thing trying to get in. In the intimacy of the small room, the social barriers between them felt thin. Nora wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Her hands were trembling. You're shaking, Caleb observed. It's the cold. She lied. It's not cold, he said. Nora looked down at the coffee. It's Victor. He is a man who likes to own things. People. Caleb watched her. He saw the bruise on her spirit, if not her skin. He saw a woman who was drowning in silk and expectations. Why do you marry him? Caleb asked. Because there is no other choice, she whispered. My father wills it. Society demands it. I have no skills. Mr. Morgan, I have no land. I have only my name and my duty. You always have a choice, Caleb said. It just might cost you everything else. Does it? Nora looked at him. You chose to keep this land, and it is costing you your life, isn't it? The bank will take it. You will have nothing. Caleb's jaw tightened. I will have my self-respect. I didn't sell out. Nora stared at him. Self-respect. A luxury she couldn't afford. Or could she? She looked around the cabin again. It was poor, stark, and filled with the ghost of his wife. She could see the grief in his eyes, a deep, standing pool of sorrow. He was lonely, not just for company, but for touch, for connection. And he was desperate for money. She looked at her valise, which Caleb had carried in. Inside, tucked in a hidden pocket, was a bank draft and a roll of bills. $2,500. Her father's allowance for her wedding trousseau and travel expenses. Money. She had money. And she had a body. A body that Victor Harrow considered his property. A body that had never known a gentle touch. Only the promise of possession. The idea struck her like a physical blow. It was insane. It was scandalous. It was the most terrifying thought she had ever had. She looked at Caleb. He was staring out the window at the brown oblivion. His profile sharp and hard. He was a good man. She knew that from the saloon. She knew that from the way he had defended her, helped her. He was strong, but he was damaged, just like her. If she gave the money to the bank, it would vanish. If she gave it to Caleb, she could save him. And what could he give her? Freedom. For one night. The freedom to be a woman, not a contract. The freedom to choose who touched her. To experience passion before the cage door slammed shut forever. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one rising in her chest. Mr. Morgan, she said. Her voice was steady, surprising her. Caleb turned his gaze from the window to her. Ma'am, how much is the debt? The exact amount to save this place. Caleb frowned, his eyes narrowing. Why do you ask? Please, just tell me. $2,000, he said, the words tasting like ash. Nora nodded slowly. She reached for her valise and set it on the table. The sound of the latch clicking open was loud in the quiet room. She didn't look at him. She looked at her hands. What if I told you I could give you that money? She asked. Caleb went still. Charity. I don't take charity from Whitfield's. Not charity, Nora said. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. A business transaction. She took a breath, the air trembling in her lungs. I will give you $2,000, Caleb, but I want to buy something in return. Caleb stared at her, confusion clouding his face. What could I possibly have that you would want? Nora stood up. She walked around the table and stopped a few feet from him. She felt the heat radiating from him. One night, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the wind's howl. One night, here, with you. Caleb stared at her, the meaning slowly sinking in, shock widening his eyes. I want to be with a man who sees me, Nora said, tears pricking her eyes. I want to know what it is to be touched without fear. Before I belong to Victor Harrow, I want to belong to myself, and I want to give that moment to you. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. The wind outside lost its screaming edge, settling into a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the chinking of the log walls. The worst of the sandstorm had passed. leaving the world outside buried in a fresh layer of brown grit. But inside the cabin, the air remained still and heavy with unspoken things. Nora paced the small length of the kitchen. Her boots, usually so silent on plush carpets, clicked sharply against the uneven floorboards. She felt a frantic energy coiling in her chest, a mixture of adrenaline and terror that made her hands cold despite the warmth of the cast-iron stove. She was 27 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was entirely unobserved by the people who owned her. There was no father to correct her posture, no victor to squeeze her wrist until the bones ground together, no society matrons to whisper about her virtue. There was only Caleb Morgan, a man who looked as though he had been carved out of the very oak and granite of this territory. He sat at the table, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the secrets of his ruin. Nora stopped pacing and gripped the back of the empty chair, the chair that belonged to a ghost. She looked at Caleb's profile. The harsh lines of his jaw softened slightly by the dim light of the kerosene lamp. "Tell me the truth, Caleb," she said, her voice startlingly loud in the small room. She watched his shoulders stiffen. He did not look up. "I told you the truth. The storm is dying down. You can ride out soon. That is not what I mean," she pressed, stepping closer. "I mean the ranch, the debt. You are a man standing on a precipice. I need to know how deep the fall is." Caleb set the cup down hard. Coffee sloshed over the rim. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You have a strange way of thanking a man for shelter." Miss Whitfield, prying into his ledger books. "It is not prying," she said, though she knew it was. "It is necessary. Please, how much would it take to make you free? To make this land yours again, untouchable by the bank or my father's associates?" Caleb exhaled, a sound of frustration and fatigue. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching against his palm. "Why do you care? You will go back to your hotel, marry your rich man, and forget you ever saw this shack." "I will not forget," she said intensely. "Tell me." $2,000, he grated out, the words tasting like bile. $2,000 covers the note, the interest, and buys feed for the winter. It saves the herd. It keeps the roof over my head for another year, maybe 2 if the market turns. 2,000, she repeated. "It might as well be the moon," Caleb muttered. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that deafened her to the wind outside. She looked at her leather valise sitting on the counter. It contained the funds her father had pressed into her hand with a dismissive pat. Money for a wedding dress she did not want, for a reception she dreaded, for a life that felt like a prison sentence. She walked to the valise. Her fingers trembled as she undid the brass clasp. It snapped open with a sound like a gunshot. Caleb watched her, confused, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" Nora did not answer. She reached into the lining and pulled out the thick roll of bills and the bank draft. She turned and walked back to the table, with a hand that shook visibly. She laid the money down on the scarred wood. The currency looked obscene against the rough grain of the table, the crisp green paper, the sharp black ink, the promise of power and ease. It sat there amidst the coffee stains and the dust, glowing in the lamplight. Caleb stared at the money. He did not move to touch it. He looked up at her, his face darkening with a mix of confusion and rising anger. "Put that away," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you, I do not take charity, especially not from a woman who feels pity for the poor rancher." "It is not charity," Nora said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she forced volume into it. "It is a payment. Payment for what?" Caleb stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He towered over her, his presence filling the room. "I pulled a wagon out of the mud. Nora, I do not charge $1,000 an hour for labor. Put it away." Nora did not retreat. She looked up into his face, seeing the pride that held him together, the rigid code of honor that was slowly starving him. She took a breath that burned her lungs. "I want to hire you. Caleb, hire me." He laughed, a short, harsh bark. "For what? To fix a fence? To drive you to Cheyenne?" For this night, she said. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to stop. The fire in the stove seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. He looked at the money, then back at her face, searching for the joke, the cruelty. But her eyes were wide and dark, filled with a terror he could not understand. "I do not understand," he said slowly. "I am offering you $2,000, Nora said, the words rushing out now, tumbling over each other. "For tonight, for you to share that bed with me." Caleb recoiled as if she had slapped him. His face flushed a dark red beneath his tan. He took a step back, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You think you can come into my house?" he growled, his voice shaking with rage. "And buy me? You think because I am poor, because I have holes in my boots, that I am a whore?" "No!" Nora cried out, stepping forward. "No! Caleb, listen to me. Get out," he said, pointing to the door. "I don't care about the storm. Take your money and get out of my house. Please," she begged, reaching out but not daring to touch him. "It is not about you being poor. It is about me being erased." She stopped, chest heaving, tears stinging her eyes. She looked down at the money, then up at him, her expression crumbling. "I am going to marry Victor Harrow," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you know what that means? He does not see me. He sees an acquisition. He sees a broodmare for his legacy. When he touches me, I feel like I am disappearing. I feel like an object on a shelf." She hugged her arms around herself, trying to hold her shattering composure together. "I have never been with a man. Caleb, I am 27 years old, and I have never known what it is to be desired. Not owned. Desired." Caleb stood frozen, his anger suspended in the air. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she stood, protective of her own body, the fear in her eyes that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the life waiting for her in town. "You want to use me," he said, but the bite was gone from his tone. "You want to use me to rebel against your father, to play at sin because you know you can go back east and wash it off." "I am never safe," she cried, her voice cracking. "There is no safety for me back east. There is only the cage. This might be the only free choice I ever make. The only time I choose who touches me. The only time I choose to give myself rather than have myself taken." She gestured to the money. "That money means nothing to me, Caleb. It is paper. But to you, it is your life. It is your wife's grave. It is your legacy. Take it, please, and give me one night where I am real." Caleb looked at the money, then at the empty side of his bed. The quilt was smooth. The pillow was cold. He felt a surge of nausea, a mix of shame and temptation that twisted his gut. $2,000. He could pay Grady tomorrow. He could fix the fences. He could buy a headstone for Hannah that wasn't made of wood. "But the cost, I cannot," he whispered. He looked at the locket in his pocket. "Though he didn't touch it, I cannot dishonor her memory, not for money, not even for your freedom." Nora's shoulders slumped. The energy drained out of her, leaving her small and defeated. She nodded slowly, tears finally spilling over her lashes and tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "I understand," she said softly. "I am sorry. I did not mean to insult you." She reached out and began to gather the bills, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled with them. "I just thought," she stammered, sniffing back a sob. "I thought, of all the men in this territory, you were the only one who wouldn't hurt me." Her words hung in the air, fragile and devastating. "You were the only one who wouldn't hurt me." Caleb watched her clumsy attempts to gather the money. He saw the vulnerability in the curve of her neck, the terrified shaking of her hands. He realized then that she wasn't a rich tourist looking for a thrill. She was a refugee. She was fleeing a brutality he could only imagine. And she had run to him. She had looked at his rough hands, his poverty, his anger, and she had seen safety. Something inside Caleb broke. It was the hard shell of guilt he had built around himself for 3 years, the armor that kept him from feeling anything but pain. It cracked, and beneath it, he found not shame, but a fierce, protective ache. He reached out and covered her hand with his His palm was calloused and warm, engulfing her trembling fingers. "Stop," he said. Nora froze. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. Caleb looked at the money under their hands, then pushed it aside. He looked only at her. "You think I am a good man," he said quietly. "I know you are," she whispered. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, wrestling with the ghosts in the room. He thought of Hannah. Hannah, who had loved life, who had loved the land. Would she want him to lose it? Would she want him to wither away in solitude, punishing himself for a death he couldn't prevent? Or would she want him to help a woman who was just as lost as he was? He opened his eyes. The decision settled over him, heavy and solemn. "If we do this," he said, his voice rough but steady, "it is not for the money. The money stays on the table until morning. If you want to leave 5 minutes from now, you leave. The money is yours to take back." Nora stared at him. "You would." "I will not take from you," Caleb said, "and I will not be bought. But if you are asking for comfort, if you are asking to be seen—" He paused, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "I can do that, but you have to be sure. There is no going back from this." "I am sure," Nora breathed. "I have never been more sure." Caleb nodded. He stepped back, giving her space. "Then we leave the money here," he said. The cabin had grown dark as the sun dipped below the horizon, the only light coming from the glowing embers in the stove and the single kerosene lamp. The wind hummed against the eaves, isolating them from the rest of the world. It felt as though the ranch house was a ship adrift on a dark ocean, and they were the only two survivors. Caleb walked to the door and threw the bolt. The sound was final. He turned and looked at her. "Come here," he said softly. Nora walked to him. She stopped a foot away. She could smell the soap he used, the scent of pine and labor. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. Caleb reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingertips grazed her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, at odds with the roughness of his skin. Nora let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull. He waited. Nora closed the distance. She rested her forehead against his chest. He was solid, unmoving. She felt his arms come around her, tentatively at first, and then with a firm, encompassing strength. He held her as if she were made of glass, precious and breakable. They stood there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the twin rhythms of their hearts, hers fluttering like a hummingbird, his steady and deep. Then he pulled back slightly and looked into her eyes. The question was there, silent and respectful. Nora nodded. She began to undo the buttons of her high collar. Her fingers fumbled. Caleb reached up and took her hands, moving them aside. "Let me," he whispered. He undid the buttons, one by one. His eyes never left hers. There was no lustful leer, only a profound, serious intensity. He peeled the layers of silk and lace away as if he were unwrapping a bandage to check a wound. When her dress fell to the floor, leaving her in her chemise, she shivered. Not from cold, but from the raw exposure. She crossed her arms over her chest, instinct taking over. Caleb took her hands and gently uncrossed them. "You don't have to hide," he said, "not here." He led her to the bed. He pulled back the quilt Hannah had stitched, and paused. A flicker of pain crossed his face, sharp and jagged. Nora saw it. She touched his arm. "We don't have to," she said. Caleb shook his head. He looked at the empty pillow, then at Nora. He realized that holding onto the emptiness was not loyalty. It was death. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. He stood and removed his shirt. Nora stared at him. He was scarred, his torso mapped with the history of a hard life, a white line across his ribs, the mottled burn on his forearm. He was imperfect, battered, and beautiful. He lay down and held the quilt open for her. Nora climbed in beside him. The mattress was straw-stuffed and firm. The sheets were coarse cotton, smelling of laundry soap and sage. She lay stiffly, her eyes wide in the semi-darkness. Caleb turned on his side, facing her. He propped himself up on one elbow. He reached out and stroked her hair back from her forehead. "You are trembling," he murmured. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Of me? No, of failing, of not knowing what to do." "There is nothing to do," Caleb said. "Just feel—" He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a devouring kiss. It was a question. His lips were dry and warm. He tasted of coffee and honesty. Nora went rigid for a moment, waiting for the aggression, the demand, but he just kept kissing her, softly, patiently, until her mouth softened under his. She let out a small, surprised sound, half gasp, half sob. Her hands came up to clutch his shoulders. The muscle beneath his skin was hard as iron, but he moved with a fluid grace. When his hand moved to her waist, his thumb tracing the curve of her hip through the thin fabric of her undergarments, she flinched. Caleb stopped instantly. "It's all right," he whispered against her neck. "I'm here. I'm not him." The words unlocked something in her. The fear began to recede, replaced by a rising tide of sensation. She realized she wanted his weight. She wanted his roughness. She wanted to be imprinted by him. She pulled him closer. "Caleb," she whispered. The night became a blur of sensation. It was not the polished, performative romance she had read about in novels. It was awkward and raw and deeply human. There were moments where Caleb's hands shook so hard he had to stop and grip the bed frame to steady himself. There were moments where Nora laughed nervously, a sound that turned into a moan of surprise as his mouth found the sensitive skin of her throat. For Caleb, touching her was like waking up from a coma. His body, dormant for so long, roared back to life with an intensity that frightened him. But he kept his promise. He chained his own desperation, moving slowly, letting her set the pace. He watched her face in the shadows, looking for any sign of fear, but he found only wonder. For Nora, it was a revelation. She learned that her body was not a bargaining chip. It was an instrument. She learned that she could ask. She guided his hand. She arched into his touch. She discovered that she had a voice even in the dark. When the inevitable moment came, there was pain, but Caleb held her through it, murmuring words she couldn't catch but that sounded like prayers, and afterwards, the pleasure that followed was sharp and bright, a reclaiming of territory she hadn't known she lost. Later, much later, the wind died down completely. The room was cooling. The fire in the stove had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals that cast long, dancing shadows on the ceiling. They lay facing each other, the quilt pulled up to their chins. Their legs were tangled together beneath the covers. Nora reached out and traced the long, jagged scar that ran across Caleb's chest. "A bull?" she asked softly. "Mustang," he answered, his voice rumbly with sleep and contentment. "Got me against a fence post 3 years ago. Broke 2 ribs." Nora ran her finger over the raised skin. "It must have hurt, only when I laughed," he said. He took her hand, the one resting on his chest, and turned it over. He pushed the sleeve of her shift up to her elbow. He looked at the faint yellow marks on her wrist, the lingering ghosts of a grip. "And these?" he asked. Nora looked at the marks. In the safety of this bed, they looked smaller, less defining. "He didn't like my tone," she said. "At a dinner party. He squeezed until I stopped talking." Caleb's thumb passed over the bruise. "Light as a feather. If he ever touches you again," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a flat, deadly calm. "I will kill him." Nora looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, as inevitable as the sunrise. "He is a powerful man. Caleb, he owns the sheriff." "He owns the bank. He doesn't own you," Caleb said. "Not anymore." Nora felt a lump form in her throat. "No, not anymore. Even if she had to go back, even if she had to play the part, she knew now that there was a part of her Victor could never reach. She had left it here, in this cabin, with this man." They fell into a silence that was not empty, but full of shared understanding. They were 2 broken things that had found a way to fit together. The gray light of pre-dawn began to bleed through the window. The world was returning. Reality was creeping back in with the cold. Nora sat up. She shivered as the quilt fell away. "I have to go," she said. "If I am not back at the hotel before the town wakes up—" Caleb nodded. He didn't try to stop her. He knew the stakes. He watched her dress. It was a reversal of the night before. The layers of silk and propriety going back on. Armor against the world. She buttoned her high collar, hiding her throat. She pinned her hair back, smoothing the wildness out of it. When she was fully dressed, she looked like Eleanor Whitfield again. But her eyes were different. They were clearer, grounded. She walked to the table. The money was still there, untouched. Caleb sat up in the bed, the quilt pooling around his waist. He watched her. Nora looked at the money, then at him. "Take it," she said. Caleb opened his mouth to argue. "Please," she cut him off. "Not as payment, as an investment, in the one thing in this world that is real to me." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked to the door and opened it. The morning air was crisp and cold, smelling of wet earth. Caleb stood up and walked to her, unashamed of his nakedness. He stopped in the doorway. "Nora," he said. She turned. "Stay," he said. The word hung there, a desperate, impossible plea. Nora's eyes filled with tears. She reached up and touched his face one last time. "If I stay, they will destroy you," she said. "And they will destroy me. I have to go back to fight him. But—" She paused, looking at the sunrise painting the prairie in gold. "For one night, I was not a piece on a chessboard. I was a woman." Caleb covered her hand with his own. "And for one night," he said, "I felt alive, instead of just surviving." She pulled her hand away, turned, and walked toward the barn where her buggy horse was stabled. Caleb watched her go. He stood in the doorway until she rode the horse out, the buggy left behind for later retrieval, and disappeared over the ridge. He turned back into the room. He walked to the table and looked down at the money. He picked up the roll of bills. It felt heavy in his hand. He didn't feel shame anymore. He felt a cold, hard resolve. He would use this. He would save the land, and he would be ready. Nora rode the horse hard back toward town, keeping to the low ground to avoid silhouetting herself against the rising sun. Her boots were splashed with mud, her dress hem ruined, but she didn't care. She felt a fierce, burning strength in her veins. She reached the outskirts of Dry Creek just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. She guided the horse toward the livery stable's back entrance, hoping to slip into the hotel unseen. She didn't notice the figure standing by the corral of the neighboring Miller ranch. Jeb, a ranch hand with a squint and a penchant for gossip, paused in his work. He leaned on his pitchfork, watching the woman in the fine dress ride past. He recognized the horse. It was one of Caleb Morgan's. And he recognized the woman. It was the Whitfield girl. He watched her vanish into the alleyways of the town. "Well, I'll be damned," Jeb whispered to the cows. He spat into the dirt, a slow grin spreading across his face. He couldn't wait to get to the saloon. In a town like Dry Creek, secrets were the only currency more valuable than gold. And he had just struck the mother lode. The early morning light in Dry Creek was not forgiving. It was a flat, gray illumination that exposed every crack in the boardwalks, every pile of horse manure in the street, and every secret trying to scurry back into the shadows. Nora approached the Hotel Imperial from the alleyway, her boots sucking at the mud that had pooled beneath the eaves during the storm. She held her skirts high, but the damage was done. The hem of her blue silk dress was heavy with wet clay, and the dust coat she wore over it was wrinkled and stained. She slipped through the side door, the one used by the kitchen staff, hoping to reach the back stairs unseen. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the strange, hollow calm she had felt riding away from the ranch. She pushed the door open and stepped into the narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and stale grease. "Good morning, ma'am." The voice stopped her cold. It was the barkeep from the saloon, a man named Silas, who was hauling a crate of empty bottles out to the refuse pile. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. Beside him, a maid named Clara paused in her scrubbing of a copper pot. Through the open door to the lobby, A traveling salesman dealing in patent tonics looked up from his morning pipe. Nora froze. She knew what they saw. They saw Eleanor Whitfield, the heiress, the Eastern lady of quality, looking as though she had been dragged through the brush. Her hair, usually pinned with geometric precision, was loose at the nape of her neck. Her face was devoid of powder, flushed with windburn and something else, a softness, a raw vulnerability that had not been there the day before. I went for a ride, Nora stammered, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. The storm caught me. Silas looked at her boots. Then he looked at her face. He didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed with a flicker of recognition. It was the look of a man who knew the difference between a woman who had weathered a storm and a woman who had been thoroughly unraveled. Must have been a long ride, Silas said slowly. The storm broke hours ago. I took shelter, Nora said, lifting her chin in a desperate attempt to summon her father's imperious manner. Now, if you will excuse me, she swept past them, her skirts rustling with a heavy, wet sound. As she hurried up the back stairs, she felt their eyes on her spine. She heard the maid whisper something, followed by the low, scratching chuckle of the salesman. The seeds were planted. In a town like Dry Creek, where boredom was the only surplus, a scandal involving the Whitfield name would grow faster than kudzu. 5 miles west, the silence in the ranch house was deafening. Caleb Morgan sat on the edge of his bed. The sun was fully up now, cutting broad slashes of light across the wooden floor. The space beside him was empty, but the indentation in the straw mattress was still visible, a ghost of the woman who had lain there. He ran a hand over his face. He felt tired, not in his body, but in his marrow. He looked at the table in the main room. The money was still there. The roll of bills and the bank draft sat exactly where Nora had left them, anchored by the coffee cup she had drunk from. $2,000. It was salvation. It was the deed to his land. It was the promise that he wouldn't have to watch strangers brand his cattle or burn his wife's drawings in the hearth. But as he looked at it, a wave of nausea rolled through him. He had sold something. He wasn't sure what it was, his dignity, his grief, his solitude, but he had traded it for paper. He remembered the feel of Nora's skin, the desperate, frantic way she had clung to him, and the way he had clung back. He hadn't just comforted her, he had taken from her. He had taken her warmth to fill the freezing void inside himself. He stood up, his movement stiff. He couldn't leave the money there. If he did, the sacrifice, hers and his, would be for nothing. He walked to the table and picked up the bills. They felt greasy, though they were crisp. He shoved them into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. He grabbed the bank draft. He walked out to the barn, saddled his bay gelding, and rode out. He didn't look back at the house. He couldn't bear to see how small it looked against the vastness of the sky. The ride to town was a blur. Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, ignoring the ache in his ribs where the old scar tissue pulled, ignoring the memory of Nora's fingers tracing that same line. When he reached Dry Creek, the town was awake and moving. Wagons clattered, horses whinnied, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out like a church bell. Caleb tied his horse in front of the bank, pulled his hat low, and went inside. The bank smelled of ink and dry paper. Mr. Grady sat behind his polished oak desk, looking like a vulture in a vest. He looked up as Caleb entered, a smug, practiced sorrow already forming on his face. "Caleb," he said, not rising, "I assume you have come to discuss the surrender of the deed. I have the papers drawn up to make it as painless as possible." Caleb walked to the desk. He didn't sit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the roll of bills and the draft. He dropped them onto the ledger book in front of Grady. $2,000, Caleb said. In full. The silence in the bank was sudden and absolute. Even the clerk in the cage stopped counting coins. Grady stared at the money. He reached out and touched the bank draft, his eyes widening as he read the signature. Charles Whitfield. He looked up at Caleb, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. This is a significant sum. Caleb, it is what I owe, Caleb said. Count it. Then give me the receipt and the clear title. Grady picked up the draft, holding it to the light. This is drawn on a Boston bank by Mr. Whitfield. It is legal tender, Caleb said, his voice hard. Grady looked at Caleb, suspicion warring with greed. He licked his lips. Of course, it is just unexpected. A man in your position, coming into such a windfall overnight. It is almost miraculous. Caleb leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the desk. He loomed over the banker. Do you want the money, Grady, or do you want to explain to your directors why you turned down cash? Grady cleared his throat nervously. No, the money is good. He began to scribble on a receipt, his pen scratching loudly, but he didn't stop talking. You know, Caleb, there are only a few ways a man comes by this kind of money so quickly in this territory. Mining, gambling, or selling something very precious. Caleb snatched the receipt from Grady's hand as soon as it was signed. My business is my own, he said. We are done. He turned and walked out, but as the door closed behind him, he heard Grady's soft, wheezing chuckle. He knew what the banker was thinking. He knew what the town would think. He had walked in a pauper and walked out a free man, carrying a bank draft signed by the father of the woman who had arrived 2 days ago. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his boots. It felt less like a breeze and more like a whisper, carrying his name from one end of the street to the other. In room 204 of the Hotel Imperial, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had bathed and changed into a fresh dress of gray wool, high-collared and severe. She had scrubbed her skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the feeling of exposure. But the memory of the cabin was stubborn. It lingered in the ache of her muscles and the ghost of Caleb's scent that she imagined was still caught in her hair. A knock at the door made her jump. Telegram. Ma'am, a boy's voice called. Nora opened the door and took the yellow envelope. She tipped the boy a nickel and closed the door, leaning her back against it. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Eleanor Stop arrangements finalized. Stop Victor secured mining rights in Colorado. Stop his firmness in business is admirable. Stop he will arrive Dry Creek shortly to escort you. Stop expect compliance. Stop father. Compliance. The word was a stone in her stomach. Her father praised Victor's firmness. He didn't know, or didn't care, that the same firmness that secured mining rights was the hand that bruised her wrist. She crushed the telegram in her fist. A day ago, this message would have paralyzed her. It would have sent her into a spiral of panic. But now, she felt a strange, cold resistance. She walked to the window and looked out. She saw the bank across the street. She saw Caleb Morgan's bay horse tied out front. She saw Caleb walk out, shoving a paper into his pocket. He looked grim, angry, and alive. She had done that. She had bought him his life back, and in doing so, she had stolen a piece of her own back from the men who treated her like livestock. She felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness over what had happened in the cabin. It was a secret, a jewel hidden in the mud. But secrets in Dry Creek were hard to keep. Downstairs, the rumor mill was already churning. Jeb, the ranch hand who had seen Nora leave the barn, was 2 whiskeys deep at the Rusty Spur. He was leaning over the bar, talking to Silas. I'm telling you, it was her, Jeb said, wiping foam from his lip. The Whitfield girl, riding Morgan's horse like the devil was chasing her. Sun wasn't even up yet. Silas polished a glass, his eyes bright with malicious delight. She came in the back door this morning, Silas added, looking like she'd been dragged through a hayloft, and Morgan just paid off his loan at the bank. Cleared $2,000 in cash. $2,000? Jeb whistled. That's a lot of money for a tumble. A woman in a bonnet, Mrs. Gable, was buying flour at the mercantile next door. The walls were thin, and the men were loud. She froze, her ears straining. The Eastern lady, the widowed rancher. $2,000. Mrs. Gable paid for her flour with shaking hands and walked briskly toward the church, where the ladies' sewing circle was meeting. By noon, the story had mutated. It wasn't just that they had slept together. The whisper was that she had bought him. That the high and mighty Miss Whitfield was so depraved she had to pay a grieving man to satisfy her unnatural Eastern appetites. Or, depending on who was telling it, that Caleb Morgan was a predator who had seduced a confused girl and extorted her fortune. Caleb felt the change in the air as he walked to the general store to buy the grain he could finally afford. Men who usually ignored him now watched him. Their gazes were heavy, speculative. He was loading the sacks of oats into his saddlebags when a man named Silas, not the barkeep, but a neighbor whose ranch bordered the north pasture, leaned against a hitching post. "Here you came into some luck." "Morgan," Silas said, chewing on a matchstick. Caleb tied the leather thong on the bag. "I paid my debts." Silas chuckled. "Must be nice, finding a gold mine in the middle of a drought. Or maybe it wasn't a mine. Maybe it was just a rich vein of hospitality." Caleb went still. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" Silas smirked. "Just saying. Some men sell cattle. Some men sell land. Heard you found a way to sell your hide for more than the beef is worth." The rage that exploded in Caleb was white-hot. It wasn't just the insult to him. It was the insult to Nora and the desecration of the memory of the night before. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed Silas by the lapels of his coat and slammed him back against the wooden post. The matchstick fell from Silas's mouth. His eyes went wide. "Say it again," Caleb hissed, his face inches from the other man's. Silas scrambled for purchase, his boots scraping the dirt. I didn't mean nothing. Caleb, it's just talk. The whole town is talking." Caleb held him there for a second, his fist drawn back. He wanted to hit him. He wanted to break the jaw that spoke the words, but he saw the fear in Silas's eyes, and he saw the crowd gathering. If he fought, he confirmed it. Violence was the language of the guilty. He shoved Silas away. The man stumbled and fell into the dust. "Keep her name out of your mouth," Caleb said, his voice low and shaking. "Or next time I won't stop." He mounted his horse and rode out, but the shame followed him. It clung to him like burrs. He felt objectified, dirty. He had done it to save the land, to save Hannah's grave. But in the eyes of these men, he was something less than a man. He was a kept creature. That evening, Nora was summoned to dinner at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, the wealthiest couple in town. It was a social obligation she could not refuse without raising more suspicion. The dining room was overstuffed with velvet furniture that had traveled too far and gathered too much dust. The roast beef was dry, and the conversation was drier. Mrs. Thornton, a woman with a face like a pinched dumpling, presided over the table. She watched Nora with eyes that were like beads of black glass. "It is so brave of you to travel alone, Miss Whitfield," Mrs. Thornton said, cutting her meat with surgical precision. "Though I suppose modern women from the East have different standards than we do." Nora took a sip of water, her hand steady by sheer force of will. "My father's business requires flexibility, Mrs. Thornton." "Indeed," the hostess said. "We were just discussing the influx of new people. So many coming west thinking they can leave their morals at the Mississippi River. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Martha, Mrs. Thornton ignored him. "It is tragic. Really, some women seem to think that because they have money, they can buy anything. Land, influence, even companionship." The room went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach knotted tight. It was a direct strike. They knew, or they thought they knew enough to twist the knife. She placed her fork down. "I believe, Mrs. Thornton, that some things cannot be bought. Integrity, for instance, or kindness." Mrs. Thornton smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "Oh, my dear, out here, everything has a price, even a widow's grief." Nora stood up. She felt like she might be sick. She had to get out. "I suddenly find myself unwell." She said, "Please excuse me." She left the house before they could protest, walking back to the hotel in the dark. The wind bit at her face. She felt dirty, exposed. The beautiful, desperate thing she had done was being dragged through the mud. She reached the hotel lobby just as a private coach pulled up outside with a heavy rattle of wheels. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a tailored gray suit that was immaculate despite the journey. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He held a silver-tipped cane, not because he needed it, but because it was a weapon he could carry in polite society. Victor Harrow. Nora froze on the stairs. He wasn't supposed to be here for another 2 days. Victor looked up. His face was handsome in a sharp, angular way, with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He saw her instantly. A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifying. "Victor," she breathed. He walked into the lobby, the hotel staff scattering like mice before a cat. He reached the bottom of the stairs and extended a hand. Nora had no choice. She walked down and placed her gloved hand in his. He raised it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, his lips cold. Then, his thumb pressed down, hard, right on the bone. "You look pale, my dear," he said, "and you are trembling. The Western air does not seem to agree with you. I'm just tired," she said, trying to pull her hand back. He held it fast. "We have much to discuss," Victor said. "Your father is anxious, and I am curious. I hear you have been making quite an impression on the locals." He released her hand, but the phantom pressure remained. That night, Victor invited himself to her room for a nightcap. He sat in the only armchair, sipping brandy he had brought with him. Nora stood by the window, her arms crossed. "The telegraph clerk tells me there was quite a storm yesterday," Victor said conversationally. "A dust storm. Vicious things." "Yes," Nora said. "It was very loud." "Where were you when it hit?" he asked. He swirled the brandy in the glass. "I was here." Nora lied. "In the hotel. I read a book." Victor took a sip. "Strange. The hotel register shows you hired a buggy in the morning, and the driver, a clumsy boy, I hear, came back to town alone, claiming you sent him for help. He said he left you 5 miles out." Nora's heart stopped. Victor had been in town for an hour, and he already knew everything. "The driver was incompetent," Nora said, keeping her voice level. I walked back, before the storm got bad." "You walked 5 miles? In silk boots?" "I got a ride," she corrected quickly. "A passing wagon." "Whose wagon?" "I didn't ask his name. He was just a traveler." Victor stood up. He walked over to her. The smell of expensive bay rum and stale tobacco filled her nose. He reached out and took her chin in his hand, forcing her to look at him. "You are a terrible liar, Eleanor. It is one of the things I find most charming about you. It makes you so easy to manage." He let go of her chin and trailed his finger down her neck to her collarbone. "I don't care about your little adventures," he whispered, "as long as you remember who owns the rights to the territory." He turned and walked to the door. "Rest well, my love. Tomorrow, I plan to visit some of your father's debtors. I like to inspect the assets before we foreclose." Caleb stood on the ridge of his boundary line. It was midnight. The town of Dry Creek was a cluster of yellow pinpricks in the distance. He felt the check in his pocket, the receipt from the bank. The land was his. The fence was his. No one could take it, but he felt hollow. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over him and Hannah. He tried to summon her face, but it was blurry. Instead, he saw Nora's eyes, wide and dark in the firelight. He felt the phantom weight of her body against his. He had saved the ranch, but standing there in the cold wind, with the coyotes howling their lonely songs in the dark, he wondered if the price of saving his dirt was losing his soul. He had let a woman pay for his pride, and now the wolves were coming for her. The next morning, the sky was a hard, brilliant blue. Caleb was in the barn, oiling a harness, when he heard the approach of a horse. He stepped out into the sunlight. Victor Harrow rode a black stallion that looked too big for the terrain. He sat the saddle with the arrogance of a man who had never had to work a horse in his life. He was dressed in his suit, a jarring sight against the weathered wood of the barn. Caleb Morgan? Victor asked, looking down. Caleb didn't take off his hat. Who's asking? Victor Harrow, representative for Charles Whitfield. Caleb felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He rested his hand on the barn door, close to the pitchfork leaning there. I don't have any business with Whitfield, not anymore. Yes, Victor said, dismounting. He walked around the yard, inspecting the corral, the repaired fence. He tapped the wood with his cane. I heard a sudden reversal of fortune. Most industrious. Caleb watched him. The man moved like a snake. I pay what I owe, Caleb said. Victor turned to face him. He smiled, showing white teeth. Indeed, $2,000 is a great deal of money for a rancher to find in his mattress, especially during a drought. I sold some stock. Caleb lied. Victor laughed softly. To whom? The ghosts. There is no market. Mr. Morgan, we both know that. He took a step closer to Caleb. They were of a height, but Caleb was broader. Victor, however, held himself with the lethal confidence of a man who could end a life with a signature. I am not here to query your finances, Caleb. I am here to thank you. Thank you. Caleb narrowed his eyes. For looking after my fiancée, Victor said. The word was like a slap. Eleanor. She tells me she was stranded. And that a kind stranger helped her. Caleb didn't blink. I help anyone who's stuck. Noble, Victor said. He looked at the house. He looked at the windows. He seemed to be sniffing the air for a scent. She is a fragile creature, Victor said, his voice dropping, prone to hysteria and flights of fancy. Sometimes she imagines connections that do not exist. It would be a shame if a simple act of charity were to be misinterpreted. Get to the point. Harrow, Caleb growled. Victor's smile vanished. The ice beneath the surface broke through. The point is this. Mr. Morgan, you have your land. Keep it. Stay on it. Because if I hear that you have been anywhere near my future wife again, or if I find out that this sudden windfall came from her purse. He didn't finish the threat. He didn't have to. He tapped the silver tip of his cane against Caleb's chest. A light, mocking tap. Enjoy your ranch. It's a lonely place to die. Victor mounted his horse and rode out, leaving a cloud of dust that tasted of expensive cologne and menace. 2 hours later, Victor found Nora in the hotel parlor. She was pretending to read a newspaper. He walked in and threw a piece of paper onto her lap. Nora looked down. It was a note from the bank. A confirmation of a deposit cleared. Paid by draft. Origin, C. Whitfield. She looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Victor stood over her, his face a mask of cold fury. Mr. Morgan paid his debt this morning, Victor said softly. $2,000, the exact amount of your travel allowance. Nora opened her mouth, but no sound came out. He is a resourceful man, Victor sneered. Or perhaps he is just a very expensive gigolo. Stop it, Nora whispered. Victor grabbed her wrist, the same one he had bruised before, and yanked her to her feet. The parlor was empty, but the door was open. Did you think I wouldn't find out? He hissed, his face inches from hers. Did you think you could buy a stud for the night and I wouldn't see the ledger? I helped a man who was losing everything, Nora cried, trying to twist away. You humiliated me, Victor shouted, shaking her. You gave our money, my money, to a dirt farmer. What did he give you? Eleanor, did he give you what you wanted? Did he make you feel rustic? Nora looked at him. She saw the violence in his eyes. She saw the future stretching out before her, a lifetime of this, of being shaken, of being questioned, of being owned. And she remembered Caleb. She remembered his gentle hands. She remembered the sunrise. He gave me more in one night than you have given me in 3 years, she said, her voice trembling but clear. He gave me respect. Victor's face went white. For a second, she thought he would strike her. Instead, he released her with a shove that sent her stumbling back into the chair. He straightened his jacket. You have made a mistake. Eleanor, a very grave mistake. He picked up the banknote. I can ruin him. You know, I can say he stole it. I can say he forced you. I can have him hanged before the sun sets." Nora gasped. "You wouldn't try me," Victor said. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair. Trapping her. "Here is your choice. You will deny everything. You will tell everyone that he tricked you, that he begged, that he is a thief. We will take the land back, and we will send him to prison. And you will come back east and learn to be a proper wife." "Or," Nora whispered. "Or you admit it," Victor said, his lip curling in disgust. "You tell the world that you are a whore who pays for it, and you watch while I destroy him slowly. I will burn that ranch to the ground, Eleanor, and I will make sure the whole territory knows exactly what you are." He straightened up and checked his pocket watch. "I have a meeting with the sheriff. You have until dinner to decide which story we are telling." He walked out, leaving Nora alone in the parlor. The silence of the room screamed at her. She was back against the wall. The trap had snapped shut, but this time she wasn't alone in the cage. Caleb was in there with her, and she had to decide whether to save his reputation by destroying his life, or save his life by destroying her own. The cottonwood grove lay 2 miles south of the town, a cluster of thirsty trees clinging to the banks of a creek that had been reduced to a trickle by the relentless drought. The leaves were brittle and brown, rattling in the dry wind like the bones of small birds. It was a place of shadows and jagged light, hidden from the road but open to the unforgiving sky. Nora waited near the trunk of the largest tree, her horse tethered deep in the brush. She wore a riding habit of dark wool, severe and hot, but her hands were bare. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers, the fabric tearing under the strain. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of dry grass, made her heart lurch against her ribs. Caleb arrived 10 minutes late. He did not come by the main trail, but filtered through the scrub oak like a ghost. He was on foot, having left his horse further down the wash to avoid being seen. His face was a mask of hard lines, his hat pulled low over eyes that were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough. "If Harrow sees you, he knows," Nora interrupted. She took a step toward him, but he did not move to meet her. He stood his ground, radiating a cold, defensive heat. "He knows about the money. Caleb. He knows the exact amount. He has seen the bank draft." Caleb looked away, staring at the muddy slurry of the creek. "Then he knows everything. He suspects everything," Nora corrected. "He does not know the truth of what passed between us. He thinks I hired you, like a laborer, or something worse." Caleb laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Is that not what you did? You put cash on the table. You bought a service. And now the whole town is going to know the price of Caleb Morgan's pride. Do not say that," Nora pleaded, the hurt sharp in her voice. "Why not? It is the truth, isn't it?" Caleb turned on her, his anger finally breaking the surface. "I walked into that bank feeling like a man who had saved his life. I walked out feeling like I had sold it. And now your fiancé is going to burn me down. Nora, he's going to take the land anyway, isn't he? But first, he is going to make sure everyone knows I am nothing but a gigolo who preyed on a rich girl. I will not let him," Nora said, though her voice shook. "You cannot stop him," Caleb shouted, the sound startling a crow from the branches above. "Look at you. Nora, you are shaking. You are terrified of him. You will go back to the hotel, and he will twist your arm until you say whatever he wants you to say. You will retreat into your world of silk and safety, and I will be left here in the mud to answer for it." "I have no safety," Nora cried out, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at her. "Do you think I am safe with him? Do you think the silk protects me?" She shoved up the sleeve of her riding jacket. The bruises from the gala were fading to a sickly yellow, but there was a new mark, a fresh, angry red welt where Victor had grabbed her the day before. "He did this because I refused to lie," she said, tears hot in her eyes. "He told me to say you stole the money. He told me to say you forced me. I refused. I told him that you gave me respect. I told him that for one night. I was chosen, not collected." Caleb looked at the mark on her wrist. The anger in his chest collided with a wave of nausea. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm. but he did not touch her. He was afraid that his touch, which had once been a comfort, was now just another source of danger. "I never meant for this to happen to you," Nora whispered. "I never meant to turn your life into a spectacle. I just wanted to breathe. And now we are both suffocating," Caleb said quietly. The sound of a horse clearing its throat cut through the air. Caleb spun around, his hand flying to the Colt revolver at his hip. Nora gasped and backed against the tree. A man stepped out from behind a screen of willow brush. He was leaning casually against his saddle, a piece of straw between his teeth. He wore a dusty duster coat and a hat with a snakeskin band. It was one of the men who had ridden into town on the private coach with Victor. "Touching," the man said, his voice like gravel rolling in a tin can. Truly touching. Caleb did not draw, but his hand stayed on the grip of his gun. "Who are you? Name's heavy," the man said. "I carry things for Mr. Harrow, sometimes luggage, sometimes messages." "You followed me," Nora said, horror dawning on her face. "Mr. Harrow worries about you, Miss Whitfield," the man drawled. "He thinks you have poor judgment in friends. He wanted to make sure you didn't get lost." "Get out of here," Caleb warned. "This is private land." "Is it?" The man looked around, feigning confusion. "I heard the bank held the paper on this section, and since Mr. Harrow speaks for the investors, well, it gets complicated, doesn't it?" He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Caleb. "The boss doesn't like secrets, Morgan, and he really doesn't like men who touch his property. He wanted me to tell you that the debt is paid." "Sure enough, but the interest? The interest is going to be high. Is that a threat?" Caleb asked. "It's an accounting term." The man smiled. "Just business." He tipped his hat to Nora. "Miss Whitfield, I'd suggest you ride back to the hotel. Mr. Harrow has a dinner planned. He hates to eat alone." The man turned and walked back into the brush, mounting his horse with a squeak of leather. He rode away without looking back, confident in his immunity. Caleb stood frozen until the hoofbeats faded. He looked at Nora. The distance between them felt like a canyon. "He will destroy you," Caleb said. "If you stay near me, he will destroy me if I leave," Nora answered. "He will take me back east and bury me in a house I cannot leave. Then we are both damned," Caleb said. The poison spread through Dry Creek with the efficiency of a fever. By the next afternoon, the narrative had been set, poured like concrete around the feet of Caleb Morgan and Eleanor Whitfield. Victor Harrow did not shout his accusations. He whispered them. He sat in Mr. Grady's office, sipping the banker's cheap whiskey, and spoke with the heavy, reluctant tone of a man burdened by a terrible truth. "It is a tragedy, really," Victor said, shaking his head. "Eleanor has always been unstable, a nervous disposition. We sent her west for the air, hoping it would calm her mind. But it seems this harsh country only unhinged her further." He leaned in, his voice dropping, "And this Morgan fellow, he saw an opportunity, a grieving man, desperate for cash. He found a confused woman with access to a checkbook. I don't want to press charges. Grady, it would destroy her reputation completely. But we must be realistic. He took advantage of a mental invalid." Grady nodded, absorbing the lie because it was easier than facing the truth. "Of course, Mr. Harrow, it explains everything. The sudden payment, her disheveled state, it is despicable." By evening, the story had reached the church, the saloon, and the mercantile. Caleb Morgan wasn't just a debtor, he was a predator. He had seduced a feeble-minded heiress. And Nora wasn't a rebel, she was a fallen woman, crazy and loose, who needed to be locked away for her own good. When Nora walked through the lobby of the hotel, conversation stopped. The clerk would not meet her eyes. A mother pulled her child closer, shielding the girl from the taint of the Eastern harlot. Nora held her head high, but inside, she was screaming. 2 nights later, the wind died completely. The air over the ranch was still and cold, the stars hanging like chips of ice in the black void. Caleb was asleep in his chair by the stove, his rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept in the bed since Nora left. He dozed in fits and starts, waking at the snap of a twig or the cry of a coyote. Jeb, the ranch hand, was sleeping in the loft of the barn to keep watch over the horses. The sound that woke Caleb wasn't a noise. It was a light, a sudden, flickering orange glow that danced against the window pane, growing brighter with every heartbeat. Caleb jerked awake. He looked out the window and his blood turned to ice. The barn. Fire. It started at the southeast corner, where the dry hay was stacked. The flames were already climbing the wall, licking at the roof shingles. Caleb kicked the door open and ran. He didn't bother with his boots. He ran in his socks across the frozen, hard-packed earth. "Jeb!" he screamed. "Jeb!" Smoke was pouring from the hayloft door. The horses inside were screaming, a high, terrifying sound that tore at Caleb's soul. He reached the main doors and threw the latch, heaving them open. Thick, black smoke billowed out, choking him. The heat was a physical blow. "Get them out!" Caleb roared, diving into the darkness. He found the first stall by feel. The mare was thrashing, kicking at the wood. Caleb grabbed the halter, his fingers fumbling with the knot. He got it loose and slapped the horse on the rump. She bolted for the open door, knocking him into the wall. Caleb scrambled up. He could hear Jeb coughing somewhere in the loft. "Jeb, jump!" Caleb yelled. He moved to the next stall. The heat was singing his hair. Sparks rained down from the rafters like cruel stars. He got the second horse loose, and the third. Then, a beam from the loft groaned and gave way. It crashed down into the center aisle, sending a geyser of sparks and burning debris into the air. Caleb shielded his face. Through the smoke, he saw Jeb fall. The old man had tried to climb down the ladder just as the beam collapsed. He hit the dirt floor hard, his leg twisting at a sickening angle. Caleb lunged forward, grabbing Jeb by the collar of his coat. He dragged him backward, inch by inch, the fire roaring like a freight train above them. The air was gone. There was only smoke and heat. They tumbled out of the barn doors and into the dirt just as the roof began to cave in. Caleb rolled Jeb away from the heat, coughing until he retched. He looked back. The barn was a torch. The structure was consumed. He could hear the panicked hoofbeats of the surviving horses fading into the dark. But from inside the inferno, there was one final, terrible scream of an animal that hadn't made it out. Then silence, save for the crackle of destruction. 5 miles away, in her hotel room, Nora stood by the window. She couldn't sleep. The town was dark. But to the west, a faint orange glow stained the horizon. It wasn't the sunrise. It was the wrong direction. She watched it, her hand pressing against the cold glass. The glow pulsed. It grew. Fire. She knew instantly. She felt it in her gut with the certainty of a physical blow. Victor had said he would burn it to the ground. He was a man of his word. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She turned and ran to the wardrobe. She threw on a heavy riding cloak over her nightdress. She didn't bother with a corset or stays. She jammed her feet into her boots and grabbed her reticule. She fled the hotel through the kitchen door, startling the night baker. She ran to the livery stable 2 streets over. The stable master was asleep in the back room. Nora didn't wake him. She found a horse, a docile mare belonging to the doctor, and fumbled with the tack. She had never saddled a horse alone in her life, but terror was a swift teacher. She managed to get the cinch tight. She led the horse out, mounted from a crate, and kicked the animal into a gallop. She rode side saddle without a proper saddle, clinging to the mane, her cloak flying behind her like a dark wing. The wind tore the pins from her hair, and it streamed loose, whipping across her face. She didn't care. She only saw the fire. When Nora arrived, the barn was a skeleton of glowing charcoal. The roof was gone. The walls were jagged teeth of blackened wood against the sky. She slid off the horse before it fully stopped, her legs nearly giving way. "Caleb!" she screamed. She saw a figure near the water trough. Caleb was kneeling beside Jeb. The old man was conscious, groaning. His legs splinted with a piece of unburnt wood and bound with strips of Caleb's shirt. Caleb looked up. His face was unrecognizable. He was covered in soot, ash, and blood. His eyebrows were singed off. His eyes were white circles in a mask of black. He stared at her as if she were an apparition. "Nora!" She ran to him, dropping to her knees in the dust. "You are alive. Thank God." Caleb stood up slowly. He looked at the ruin of his barn. He looked at the dead calf that lay near the door, half buried in debris. He looked at Jeb, who was pale and shivering in shock. "This is his doing," Caleb said. His voice was dead, flat. "I know." Nora wept. "I saw the light. I knew." Caleb turned to her. The rage in his eyes was terrifying. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of the saloon. It was cold. It was the anger of a man who has nothing left to lose. "He did this to warn me," Caleb said. "To warn me away from you. He did this because he is a monster." Nora grabbed his soot-stained hands. "Caleb, listen to me. We cannot stay here. He will not stop. I am not leaving my land," Caleb said. "I will grab my rifle and I will ride into town and I will put a bullet in his chest." "No!" Nora shook him. "If you do that, you hang, and he wins. He wants you to attack him. He has the sheriff. He has the law. You will be the crazy rancher who murdered a businessman. I don't care." Caleb pulled away from her. "Look at this. Nora, look at Jeb. He broke his leg. My stock is scattered. He burned it down. I can fix it," Nora cried out. Caleb froze. "What? I have money," Nora said, the words tumbling out. "I have a trust. My grandmother left it to me. Victor cannot touch it. I can wire for it. I can build you a new barn. I can buy new stock. I can pay for a doctor for Jeb." Caleb stared at her. The offer hung in the air, toxic and sweet. "You want to pay for this too?" he asked quietly. "Just like you paid for the night?" "It is not like that. It is exactly like that," Caleb shouted. "You think your money fixes everything. You think you can patch up my pride with gold coins. I am not your charity case. Nora, I am not a pet that you keep. I am trying to save your life," Nora screamed back, her fear turning into fury. "Why are you so stubborn? Why is your pride more important than your survival?" "I love you." The words silenced them both. The wind hissed over the embers. A beam settled with a shower of sparks. Nora stood there, chest heaving, her hair wild around her face, her cloak dusty and torn. She had said it. Caleb looked at her. He looked at the woman who had ridden through the dark, who had defied every law of her world to come to him. He saw the soot on her cheek. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He closed the distance between them. He didn't speak. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her against him. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of smoke and ash and salt tears. It was a collision of two people standing on the edge of a cliff. Caleb buried his hands in her hair, holding her as if the earth were trying to buck him off. Nora clung to his ruined shirt, her fingers digging into his back. "I am sorry," he gasped against her mouth. "I am so sorry. Don't send me back," she sobbed. "Please don't send me back to him." "I won't," Caleb vowed. "I won't." He pulled back to look at her. His thumb wiped a streak of ash from her cheek. "But we can't stay here. You are right. If we stay, he will kill me, or he will take you. He has the men. He has the power." "What do we do?" Nora asked. Caleb looked toward the mountains to the west. The peaks were jagged shadows against the stars. "We go high," he said. "We disappear. We go where his private coach and his hired guns can't follow." "For how long?" "Long enough to think," Caleb said. "Long enough to come up with a plan to fight him in the daylight. We can't fight him in the dark. Nora, he owns the dark." He looked down at Jeb. "We have to get Jeb to the Millers. They are good people." "They won't talk. And then?" "And then we ride," Caleb said. They moved with the frantic efficiency of fugitives. Caleb hitched the wagon and loaded Jeb into the back, covering him with blankets. They drove to the Miller Ranch 3 miles south. Caleb woke Silas Miller, the same man he had shoved in town, and begged for help. Silas saw the fire in the distance. He saw the blood on Jeb's leg. He saw the Whitfield girl shivering in the wagon seat. The code of the West, deeper than gossip, took over. "I'll watch him," Silas said gruffly. "You get moving. Victor's men will be looking for tracks come dawn." "Thank you," Caleb said. "Don't thank me," Silas spat. "Just don't bring the war back here." They returned to the burnt ranch only long enough to pack saddlebags. Caleb took his rifle, a box of ammunition, a sack of flour, coffee, and jerky. Nora found a pair of Caleb's spare trousers and a heavy wool shirt. She changed in the dark house, shedding the silk in the cloak. When she came out, she looked small but determined. She looked at the money on the table, the bills she had left, the ones Caleb had tried to refuse, the ones he had eventually used. It was gone. He had paid the debt, but the debt had just changed shape. They mounted the horses. Caleb rode his bay. Nora rode the doctor's mare. They rode west, away from the rising sun. The ascent was brutal. The trail was little more than a deer run that wound up through the foothills and into the granite spine of the Rockies. The air grew thin and cold. The vegetation changed from sagebrush to scrub oak, then to towering lodgepole pines that blocked out the sky. They didn't speak. They saved their breath for the climb. By late afternoon, the weather turned. The clear blue sky was swallowed by heavy, bruised clouds that rolled over the peaks. The temperature plummeted. "It's too early for snow," Nora shouted over the rising wind. "It's only September. In the high country, the calendar doesn't matter," Caleb yelled back. "We need shelter." The snow began as hard, stinging pellets, then thickened into heavy, wet flakes that stuck to their eyelashes and numbed their hands. The world turned white. The trail vanished. Caleb navigated by memory and instinct. He knew of an old trapper's line shack near the timberline, a place used by hunters in the deep winter. They found it just as the light failed. It was a squat, ugly structure of rough-hewn logs, half buried in the side of the mountain. The door was stuck with ice, and Caleb had to shoulder it open. Inside, it was freezing and smelled of rodents and old pine needles, but it was dry. They brought the horses into the lean-to shed attached to the back, rubbing them down with dry grass. Then they stumbled into the cabin. Caleb found a stack of dry wood in the corner. His hands were so cold he could barely hold the match, but he managed to get a fire going in the stone hearth. As the flames caught, casting flickering shadows on the log walls, Nora sank down onto the dirt floor. She was exhausted. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed. She was wearing a man's clothes. She was a fugitive, and she had likely lost her reputation, her inheritance, and her place in society. Forever. Caleb turned from the fire. He looked at her. The soot was still on his face, but the heat of the fire was bringing the color back to his skin. He sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took her hand. Outside, the wind howled, piling snow against the door, sealing them in. The trap had snapped shut, but for the first time in days, staring into the fire with Caleb's hand in hers. Nora didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like she had finally arrived. "We are trapped," she whispered, listening to the storm. "Yes," Caleb said, squeezing her hand. "We are." He looked at her, and the desire that had been dampened by fear and adrenaline began to uncoil again, warm and insistent. "But we are trapped together," he added. And in the silence of the high country, far from the judgments of Dry Creek and the reach of Victor Harrow, that was all that mattered. The cabin was a small, dark fist clenched against the mountain's side. Inside, the world had shrunk to a 12 by 12-foot square of rough-hewn logs, the smell of pine resin, and the radius of heat cast by the stone hearth. Outside, the blizzard did not just fall, it assaulted. The wind shrieked through the high passes, a constant, high-pitched keening that sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Snow piled high against the single door, sealing the cracks with ice. But the drafts still found their way in, seeking warmth like hungry ghosts. Caleb knelt by the fire, feeding it one precious split log at a time. The wood supply was low, leftover cords from a trapper who hadn't been here in seasons. They had to make it last. He looked over at Nora. She was sitting on a crate, wearing his spare wool trousers and a flannel shirt that swallowed her frame. She was trying to mend a tear in the canvas saddlebag with a bone needle she had found on the mantel. Her fingers, usually so graceful on a teacup or a fan, were clumsy with the cold. She pricked herself, wincing, but she did not stop. The fine lacquer of Eleanor Whitfield had been scoured away. What was left was something rawer, harder, and infinitely more real. "You need to wrap the thread twice," Caleb said quietly. "It holds the tension better." Nora looked up. Her hair was a tangled mane falling over her shoulders, unwashed and beautiful. She nodded and redid the stitch, like this. Caleb moved to her side. He took her hands in his. They were ice cold. He rubbed them briskly, feeling the delicate bones beneath the skin. "You have to keep the blood moving," he said. "If your hands go numb, you can't work. If you can't work, we don't eat." It was a harsh lesson, but the mountains did not tolerate guests who expected service. Over the last 2 days, Caleb had taught her how to bank the fire so it would burn slow and hot all night. He taught her how to listen to the groan of the snowpack on the slopes above, distinguishing the wind from the rumble of a potential avalanche. He showed her how to slice the dried jerky against the grain to make it chewable. Nora learned with a terrifying focus. She chopped wood, the heavy axe vibrating up her arms, jarring her teeth. She missed the first few times, the blade biting uselessly into the dirt. But she set her jaw and swung again until the wood split with a sharp crack. She carried snow in the iron pot to melt for water, her breath pluming in the freezing air. There was no room for propriety here. There was only survival. "I never knew," Nora said, watching the fire eat the wood. "Knew what?" Caleb asked. "That life was this heavy," she said. "In Boston, heat comes from a vent, water comes from a tap, food appears on a plate. I never thought about the cost of staying alive for one more day." "It is a good thing to know," Caleb said. "It makes you careful. It makes me feel small," she countered. Caleb looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "You are not small. Nora, you rode through a fire. You climbed a mountain in a blizzard. I know men who would have died halfway up the trail." Nora flushed, a spot of color on her pale cheeks. She looked down at her hands, rougher now, stained with soot. "I am not doing it for courage. Caleb, I am doing it because I am terrified." "Fear is fuel," Caleb said, "as long as you burn it and don't let it burn you." The nights were the hardest and the best. The cold at this altitude was a physical weight. It pressed through the chinking, turning the water in the bucket to solid ice within hours of sunset. They had only the one narrow pallet near the hearth, a pile of old furs and their own saddle blankets. To sleep apart was to freeze. The first night, they had lain stiffly, backs to each other, a foot of cold air between them. But by the second night, instinct and necessity had won. "Come here." Caleb had grunted, pulling the bearskin rug over them both. They lay spooned together, Caleb's broad chest pressed against Nora's back, his arm heavy over her waist to anchor the blankets. They were fully clothed, but the heat of their bodies created a small, secret climate under the furs, in the dark, and with the wind howling like a demon trying to tear the roof off. The silence between them broke. "Nora!" Caleb whispered into her hair. "Are you awake?" "Yes," she answered. "I can't stop thinking about the barn, the horses. We saved most of them," Caleb said. "But the fire, it was so fast." Nora shifted, turning in his arms so she could see his face in the dying glow of the embers. Caleb looked at the ceiling. Fire takes everything. It doesn't bargain. He was quiet for a long time. Then, his voice came, lower and rougher than before. "When Hannah died," he said, the name sounding strange in the room. "It wasn't fast. It took 2 days." Nora went still. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the slow, heavy thud of his heart. The midwife was a good woman. Caleb continued, "But the baby was turned wrong, and the bleeding, it just wouldn't stop. I stood in the doorway. I held towels. I boiled water. I did everything I was supposed to do, and I watched the life drain out of her like water from a cracked cup." He closed his eyes. "She looked at me at the end. She didn't look scared. She just looked disappointed, like she was sad to be leaving the party early, and I felt useless. I was a man who could break a horse, build a house, fight off a wolf. But I couldn't stop the blood. He let out a shaky breath. After that, I decided I would never love anything I couldn't protect. If you don't love it, it can't kill you when it leaves. Nora moved her hand up to his cheek, her thumb tracing the stubble along his jaw. That is why you were so angry when I offered the money, she whispered. Because I was trying to save you. And you think you don't deserve to be saved. I was angry because I wanted to say yes, Caleb admitted. I was angry because I looked at you and I didn't see a transaction. I saw a life raft, and I knew if I grabbed it, I would drown you with me. You didn't drown me, Nora said fiercely. You woke me up. She propped herself up on one elbow, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. The cold air bit her skin, but she didn't cover herself. Do you know how my father says I love you? She asked. Caleb shook his head. He doesn't, Nora said. He says, that is satisfactory, Eleanor, or you have pleased me today. His affection is a wage. You earn it by being quiet, by being pretty, by standing where he tells you to stand. If you step out of line, the wage is withheld. He starves you of it until you are begging for a crumb of approval. She looked at Caleb, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I grew up thinking love was a contract. You do your duty, you get your payment. That is why I came to you with money. Caleb, I didn't know how else to ask for what I needed. I thought I had to buy it. And now? Caleb asked, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head. Now I know that the only things worth having are the things you cannot buy, she said. She leaned down and kissed him. This kiss was different from the ones in the cabin during the storm. Those had been desperate, fueled by adrenaline and the novelty of touch. This kiss was slow. It was heavy with history, with the shared trauma of the fire, with the knowledge of his grief and her captivity. It was a question and an answer, all at once. Caleb pulled her down. The furs rose up around them, shutting out the cabin, shutting out the storm. He touched her with a reverence that made her throat ache. His hands, rough and scarred, moved over her body not to possess, but to memorize. He mapped the curve of her hip, the line of her spine, the softness of her breast. And Nora, who had been raised to be a statue, learned to move. She learned to arch into his touch, to guide his hands, to whisper his name against his skin. Wait, she whispered, pulling back just an inch. Caleb froze. What is it? I don't want this to be like before, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I don't want to think about the money on the table. I don't want to think about the bargain. There is no money on the table, Caleb said. There is only us. Nora looked into his eyes. Then this is mine. I choose this. I choose you. Not for safety, not for rebellion, just for you. To hear her say it, to hear that she, who could have had any man in the East, chose the broken rancher in a storm-battered shack, healed something in Caleb that he hadn't known was broken. He kissed her, and the kiss was a promise. They moved together in the firelight. It was not a frantic coupling. It was a slow, deep conversation of bodies. Caleb shed his guilt, realizing that loving Nora did not mean forgetting Hannah. It meant honoring the life he still had. Nora shed her shame, realizing that her desire was not a flaw, but a strength. When they finally lay still, tangled in each other in the furs, the wind outside seemed to lose its teeth. They were warm, they were whole, and they were, for this one suspended moment, entirely free. 2 days later, the storm broke. Nora woke to a silence so profound it rang in her ears. She pushed the furs aside and went to the small window. She scraped the frost away with her fingernail. Oh, she breathed. Caleb joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The world outside had been remade in diamond and glass. The sun was just cresting the eastern peaks, setting the snowfields on fire with a blinding orange light. The pine trees bowed under heavy white cloaks. The sky was a blue so deep it looked like the ocean upside down. It was impossibly beautiful. It was terrifyingly indifferent. "It's over," Caleb said. "The storm is over," Nora corrected. "The rest is just beginning." They stepped outside into the crystalline air. It was so cold it burned their lungs, a sharp, cleansing pain. Their breath hung in clouds before them. Caleb walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down the valley. The snow was deep, but the sun would melt the lower trails by noon. Victor's men would be coming, or they would be waiting. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, his voice flat. "We have no food left, and they will find the tracks eventually." "I know," Nora said. She stood beside him, squinting against the glare. "So we go back," Caleb said. "We go back," Nora agreed. "But not to hide. No." Caleb turned to her. He looked at her face, scrubbed clean by the snow, her eyes clear and fierce. "We go back to finish it." He outlined the plan as they packed the horses. It was risky. It relied on the conscience of a town that had already judged them. "We ride straight down the main street," Caleb said, tightening the cinch on the bay. "No sneaking in the back. We go to the sheriff. I accuse Victor of arson. I accuse him of intimidation. He will deny it," Nora said. "He will say you are lying to cover your debts. That is why you have to speak," Caleb said. He looked at her, his expression pained. "You have to tell them, Nora, about the money, about the bargain, about everything." Nora felt a cold knot in her stomach. To tell the truth was to destroy her reputation forever. She would be the woman who paid for a man. She would be a pariah. But she looked at the scar on Caleb's chest. She thought of the fire in the barn. She thought of Victor's thumb pressing on her wrist. "I will tell them," she said. "I will tell them that I bought a night of freedom because my fiancé offered me a lifetime of slavery." Caleb nodded. "It's a hard thing I am asking." "You didn't ask," Nora said. "We chose." The descent was treacherous. The horses struggled in the deep drifts, plunging to their chests in snow. They had to dismount and lead them for the first few miles, sweating in the freezing air. By midday, they reached the lower switchbacks where the snow thinned to a slushy mud. The air grew warmer, heavier. They were descending back into the world of men. The trail narrowed at a place called Devil's Elbow. On one side, a sheer rock wall rose 100 feet. On the other, a steep drop-off fell away to the creek bed below. The path was barely wide enough for 2 horses. Caleb stopped. He held up a hand. "What is it?" Nora whispered. Caleb scanned the rocks above. "It's quiet. Too quiet. Even the jays aren't calling." He drew his rifle from the scabbard. "Stay close to the wall. Nora, keep your head down." They moved forward inch by inch. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Then, a rock clattered down from the heights. "Move!" Caleb shouted. He slapped the rump of Nora's horse. The mare surged forward just as a gunshot cracked the air. A puff of dust exploded from the rock face right where Nora's head had been a second before. The canyon erupted in noise. Gunfire echoed off the stone, magnifying the sound into a chaotic roar. "Get down! Get behind the boulders!" Caleb yelled, swinging his own horse around to block the line of sight. He raised his rifle and fired blindly at the rim of the cliff. He saw a hat pop up and duck back down. Nora slid from her saddle, dragging the mare behind a cluster of large granite slabs that had fallen from the wall. She was shaking, her mouth tasting of copper and dust. "Caleb!" she screamed. Caleb was off his horse, scrambling for cover as bullets chipped the stone around him. He dove behind the rock next to her. He hissed in pain, grabbing his left arm. "You're hit!" Nora cried. She looked at his sleeve. The heavy wool was torn, and blood was already soaking through, dark and wet. "It's a scratch," Caleb gritted out, levering a fresh round into his Winchester. "They're high up. They have the angle, but they can't see us if we stay tight to the wall." He peered around the edge of the rock and fired 2 quick shots. A man yelled out in pain from above. "That's one," Caleb muttered. Nora stared at the blood on his arm. It was dripping onto the snow-dusted ground. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. She remembered the cabin. Fear is fuel. She looked at her clothes. She was wearing trousers. No petticoats to tear. She unbuttoned the top of her flannel shirt, ripping the fabric of her camisole underneath. It was fine cotton. She tore a long strip, the sound sharp in the lull of gunfire. "Give me your arm," she ordered. "Not now," Caleb said. "Eyes on the ridge." "Now!" Nora yelled. "You can't shoot if you bleed out." Caleb looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. He shifted, allowing her to access the wound. It was a deep graze. A furrow plowed through the muscle of his upper arm. It was ugly, but it hadn't hit the bone or the artery. Nora worked quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos. She wrapped the cloth tight, pulling the knot hard. Caleb winced, but didn't make a sound. "Good job," he grunted. "From the ridge," a voice called out. It was the man with the snakeskin hat. "Heavy, give it up, Morgan. You're pinned. The boss just wants the girl. Send her out, and you can walk away." Caleb looked at Nora. "Tell him to go to hell," Nora whispered. Caleb smiled, a grim, bloodied baring of teeth. "She says she's busy," Caleb shouted back. "And I'm not walking anywhere until I put a bullet in your other leg." He fired again, the shot ricocheting dangerously close to the attacker's position. The men on the ridge conferred. They had lost the element of surprise. They had a wounded man, and they knew that prolonged gunfire would eventually draw the attention of miners or travelers on the lower road. "Pull back," Heavy shouted. "We can't just leave them," another voice argued. "We ain't getting paid to die on a rock. Pull back." The sound of scrambling boots and retreating horses filtered down. Then, silence returned to the canyon, heavy and ringing. Caleb didn't move for 5 minutes. He kept the rifle trained on the rim. Finally, he sagged against the rock, exhaling a long breath. "They're gone," he said. Nora slumped back against the granite. She looked at her hands. They were covered in Caleb's blood. She looked at him. He was pale, sweating despite the cold, but alive. "We made it," she whispered. Caleb turned to her. He reached out with his good hand and pulled her to him. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was the desperate clinging of two soldiers who had survived a mortar shell. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of sweat and fear and life. "You did good," he murmured. "You did good." "Nora." She held him tight, feeling the bandage under her fingers. She realized then that there was no going back to the woman she had been. That woman would have fainted. That woman would have surrendered. This woman, the one with blood on her hands and a man in her arms, was someone new. "Let's go," Caleb said, pulling back. Before they realized they made a mistake. They rode into Dry Creek an hour before sunset. They were a sight that stopped traffic. Caleb led the way on his bay. He was hatless, his hair matted with sweat. His left sleeve was soaked in dried blood, the white bandage stark against the dark wool. He rode with his rifle across his saddle, his face set in a mask of cold fury. Beside him, riding astride, was Eleanor Whitfield. She wore men's trousers and a torn shirt. Her hair hung wild and loose. Her face was streaked with soot and dust. She did not look down. She looked straight ahead, her eyes burning with a strange, terrifying light. People stepped off the boardwalks to watch them pass. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. The storekeep came to the window. The silence rippled outward from them like a wave. They didn't ride to the sheriff's office. They rode to the Hotel Imperial. Victor Harrow was standing on the porch. He had been waiting for news from his men. He was dressed in his immaculate gray suit, a cigar in his hand. When he saw them, the cigar fell from his fingers. He watched them approach. He saw the blood on Caleb. He saw the defiance in Nora. He saw the way they rode close together, knee to knee, a united front that no amount of gossip could sever. Caleb pulled his horse up 10 feet from the porch. The animal danced nervously, smelling the tension. Townsfolk began to gather. "Mr." Grady came out of the bank. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, his hand on his gun belt. "Victor!" Caleb called out. His voice was raspy but loud enough to carry to the end of the street. Victor didn't move. He stood on the raised porch, looking down at them with a sneer that was beginning to falter at the edges. "Mr. Morgan," Victor said, "you look like you've had a rough ride. And you, Eleanor, you look like a savage." Caleb didn't bait. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He winced as his boots hit the dirt, but he didn't stumble. He reached up and helped Nora down. She stood beside him. She didn't hide behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder. "Sheriff," Caleb shouted, not taking his eyes off Victor. "I want to report a crime." The sheriff stepped forward, looking nervous. "Now, Caleb, let's not cause a scene." "Arson," Caleb said, pointing a bloodied finger at Victor. "Attempted murder and assault," Victor laughed. It was a thin, brittle sound. "You are delirious. Morgan, the loss of your barn has unhinged you. Tell them." "Nora," Caleb said softly. Nora stepped forward. She looked at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Thornton. She saw the maid who had sneered at her. She saw the faces of the people who had judged her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the town that tried to break her. "He is telling the truth," Nora said, her voice clear and ringing. "Victor Harrow ordered the fire, and his men just tried to kill us on the pass." She looked up at Victor. "And that is not all," she said. Victor's eyes widened. He took a step forward. "Eleanor, be quiet. You are hysterical. You need a doctor." "I do not need a doctor," Nora said. "I need witnesses." She began to unbutton the cuff of her shirt. The crowd leaned in. The reckoning had arrived. The wooden doors of the Dry Creek meeting hall swung open with a violence that slammed the iron handles against the wall. The sound cracked like a whip through the humid air of the room, instantly silencing the murmur of 50 conversations. The hall, which served as a church on Sundays and a court of public opinion on weekdays, was packed. It smelled of sawdust, damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Sheriff Miller stood at the front near the pulpit, looking weary, while Victor Harrow sat in the front pew, his posture relaxed, his gray suit immaculate amidst the sea of dusty denim and canvas. Caleb Morgan and Eleanor Whitfield walked down the center aisle. They looked like survivors of a war the town did not yet know it was fighting. Caleb was hatless, his face streaked with dried blood and mud, his left arm bound tightly in a strip of white cotton that was already staining red. He carried his rifle not as a threat, but as a walking stick, leaning on it heavily with each step. Nora walked beside him. She wore men's trousers and a flannel shirt that was too big for her, her hair loose and tangled, falling around her shoulders like a dark storm cloud. She did not look at the floor. She looked straight ahead, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath, waiting for the lightning strike. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his pistol. "Now, Caleb, you can't just barge in here." "I am not barging," Caleb rasped. His voice was rough, scarred by smoke and shouting, but it carried to the back of the room. "I am reporting a crime." Victor Harrow stood up slowly. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket. He turned to the crowd, a small, pitying smile playing on his lips. "The only crime here," Victor said smoothly, "is the one you committed against this poor woman's reputation, and perhaps the theft of her sanity." Caleb ignored him. He looked at the sheriff, then at the assembled townsfolk. He saw the faces of men he had known for 10 years, men who had turned their backs on him in the street. He saw the women who had whispered about Nora behind their fans. "Victor Harrow ordered the burning of my barn," Caleb said. He stood tall, despite the pain radiating from his arm. "He ordered his men to ambush us at Devil's Elbow. They fired on us from the ridge. They shot me. And they tried to kill Miss Whitfield." Gasps rippled through the room. Victor chuckled, a low, resonant sound that suggested he was dealing with a petulant child. "This is absurd," Victor said. "I am a businessman. I do not burn barns. I do not ambush people in canyons." He turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff, look at him. He is desperate. He is a debtor who found a way to pay his loan by exploiting a confused young woman. and now that I have exposed him, he is inventing fairy tales to cover his tracks. Victor pointed a manicured finger at Caleb. He is lying to you, just as he lied about where he got the money. He seduced my fiancée, twisted her mind, and now he is trying to destroy my character to save his own miserable skin. The crowd murmured in agreement. It was an easier story to believe. It fit the shape of the world they understood. Rich men were powerful, and poor men were desperate. No, the word was not shouted, but it cut through the noise like a razor. Nora stepped forward. She moved out of Caleb's shadow and stood in the center of the aisle. She looked small in her oversized clothes, but she stood with the posture of a queen facing the executioner. He is not lying, Nora said. Her voice shook, but she forced it steady. And he did not seduce me. Victor's eyes narrowed. Eleanor, be quiet. You are unwell. I have never been more well in my life, Nora said. She turned to face the town. She looked at Mrs. Thornton in the second row. She looked at the banker, Mr. Grady. She looked at the shopkeep. You want to know where the money came from, she said. You have whispered about it for days. You have judged him. You have judged me. So I will tell you. She took a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass. I offered Caleb Morgan $2,000, she said clearly. The room went deadly silent. I offered him the money. She continued, her voice rising. For one night, I asked him to let me sleep in his bed. I asked him to touch me. I asked him to make me feel like a human being. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A woman in the back cried out, "Oh, Lord!" Men stared at the floor, faces flushing red. Mr. Grady looked as though he might swallow his tongue. It was the confession of a sin so brazen, so contrary to every rule of their society, that it stunned them into paralysis. Victor seized the moment. "You see," he shouted, his voice dripping with righteous venom. "She is mad. She is a fallen woman, confessing to prostitution in the house of God. She is hysterical." "I am not hysterical," Nora shouted back, spinning to face him. She ripped up the sleeve of her flannel shirt. She thrust her arm out for the whole room to see. The bruises from the gala were fading yellow, but the fresh marks from Victor's grip in the hotel parlor were dark. Angry purple fingerprints on her pale skin. "This is what you did to me," Nora cried. "You squeezed me until I cried out, and then you smiled. You told me I was an acquisition. You told my father I was an asset to be merged." She turned back to the crowd, tears streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. I was trapped. I was going to be sold to this man like a head of cattle. I had no power. I had no voice. The only thing I had was the money in my valise. So I used it. I bought the only thing I could. I bought one night where I belonged to myself. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with a fierce, heartbreaking pride. And Caleb Morgan. He did not want the money. He refused it. He told me his honor was worth more than $2,000. But he saw that I was drowning. He saw that I was terrified. So he agreed. Not for the gold, but to save me. She looked back at the town, her eyes pleading for understanding. He treated me with kindness. He treated me with respect. He never took more than I gave. For one night, I was not an heiress. I was not a victim. I was just a woman, and he was the only man in this entire territory who was decent enough to see that. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of shame. The townsfolk looked at the bruises on her arm. They looked at the polished arrogance of Victor Harrow. And they looked at Caleb, standing bloody and battered, who had taken a bullet to protect the woman who had allegedly bought him. Victor saw the tide turning. He saw the doubt in the sheriff's eyes. His control was slipping, and panic made him vicious. "She is lying," Victor roared, his composure cracking. "She is a whore who paid for a stud, and he is a thief. Look at the banknote. It proves extortion. I can prove the arson." The voice came from the back of the hall. Everyone turned. A man was standing in the doorway. It was Mr. Higgins, the telegraph clerk. He was a small man, usually invisible, but now he held a stack of papers in his shaking hands. "I have the telegrams," Higgins said, his voice trembling. From Mr. Harrow to his associates in Denver, sent 3 days ago. He walked forward, the crowd parting for him. He ordered the men to come. Higgins read from the paper. He said, "The rancher is a problem. Burn him out if you have to." Make it look like an accident, or make it look like a warning. Just get it done. Victor's face went white. That is a breach of privacy. That is illegal. Sheriff Miller stepped off the pulpit. He walked toward Victor. The weariness was gone from his face, replaced by a hard, cold resolve. In this town, Mr. Harrow, arson is a hanging offense. Privacy comes second. Victor backed up until his legs hit the pew. "You cannot touch me. I am Charles Whitfield's representative. I own half this town." "Not anymore," Caleb said. Sheriff Miller unhooked the thumb brake on his holster. "Victor Harrow, I'm placing you under arrest for arson, assault, and attempted murder. Surrender your weapon." The room held its breath. Victor looked at the sheriff. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Nora, who was staring at him with a look of absolute loathing. He realized it was over. The illusion of his untouchable power had shattered against the truth of a woman he had underestimated. "No," Victor whispered. His hand blurred. He reached inside his jacket. "Gun!" someone screamed. Panic erupted. Women threw themselves to the floor, dragging children down. Men scrambled over pews. Caleb did not scramble. He saw the glint of nickel-plated steel as Victor drew the small revolver from his shoulder holster. He saw the barrel swing toward Nora. Caleb moved. He didn't think about his injury. He didn't think about the future. He lunged forward, throwing his body across the aisle, placing himself between the gun and the woman he loved. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Caleb felt a blow like a sledgehammer hit his right shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard, hitting the floor with a bone-jarring thud. "Caleb!" Nora screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically searching for the wound. Blood was already pooling on the floorboards, bright and terrifying. Sheriff Miller didn't hesitate. He tackled Victor, slamming him into the pew. 2 other men, the blacksmith and the baker, jumped into the fray. Wrestling the gun from Victor's hand, they dragged him to the floor, pinning him under their weight. Victor shouted, cursing, spitting, but the fear of him was gone. He was just a man in a dirtied suit, bleeding from a split lip. Nora didn't look at Victor. Her world had narrowed to the man on the floor. "Caleb," she sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." Caleb blinked up at the ceiling. The pain was a white-hot fire, but he could feel Nora's hands on him. "I'm here," he gritted out, his teeth stained with red. "I'm not going anywhere." The town doctor pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Nora. "Move aside. Let me see." Nora didn't want to let go, but she pulled her hands back. They were covered in blood. Again, the doctor ripped Caleb's shirt open. He probed the wound. Caleb groaned, his back arching off the floor. "It missed the lung," the doctor announced, his voice tight, broken collarbone, heavy blood loss, "but he will live." Nora slumped forward, burying her face in Caleb's neck, weeping with a relief that shook her entire body. Caleb lifted his good hand, the one that wasn't shot, and rested it on her hair. "It's done," he whispered. "It's done." The days that followed dissolved into a blur of pain, fever, and the slow, rhythmic passage of sun and shadow across the floor of the doctor's spare room. Caleb burned with infection for 3 days. He tossed and turned, murmuring names from his past. Hannah, his mother. Nora. Nora did not leave his side. She slept in a chair. She fed him broth, spoon by spoon. She changed the bandages, washing the angry, swollen wounds with cool water and carbolic acid. The town watched her. The church ladies, who had initially crossed the street to avoid her, began to bring food. They left covered dishes on the doctor's porch, stews, fresh bread, apple pies. They didn't speak to her directly, but the judgment in their eyes had softened into a grudging respect. They had seen her stand up to Victor Harrow. They had heard her confess her shame to save a man. In the harsh code of the West, courage canceled out a multitude of sins. On the 4th day, The fever broke. Caleb opened his eyes and saw Nora. She was pale, circles under her eyes, but she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking over the mountains. "You stayed," he rasped. "I told you," she said, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. "I choose this." News arrived from the east a week later. The scandal of Victor's arrest had reached Boston via telegraph. Charles Whitfield, faced with the public disgrace of his representative and the revelations of his daughter's condition, had acted with ruthless efficiency. A letter arrived for Nora. It was short. Her father disowned her. He cut her off from the family fortune, stating that she had ruined the Whitfield name. But in the same dispatch, he announced the liquidation of his assets in Dry Creek. He wanted no part of the town that had arrested his agent. He was selling the debt to a local consortium and withdrawing completely. Victor Harrow was transported to the territorial prison in Laramie to await trial. He left Dry Creek in shackles, sitting in the back of a wagon, watching the town he had tried to rule fade into the dust. The bank, freed from the pressure of the Eastern investors, renegotiated the loans. With the drought breaking and the promise of a fair market, the ranchers could breathe again. Caleb's debt was gone, paid in full by the money Nora had given him, the money that had started everything. It was 6 weeks before Caleb could walk without a cane, and another month before he could lift a saddle. Autumn settled over the plains. The cottonwoods turned to gold, and the air grew crisp and sweet. On a Tuesday morning, under a sky that stretched forever, Caleb stood on the porch of his ranch house. The barn was still a blackened ruin, but the corrals were repaired. The cattle were grazing on the winter wheat. Nora came out of the house. She was wearing a simple calico dress she had sewn herself, having sold the last of her silk to buy supplies. She held 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Caleb and leaned against the railing beside him. "Mister, Grady tells me the rail line is looking to buy beef next spring," she said, "at a fair price." Caleb took a sip. "That's good news. We'll have a herd by then." Nora looked out at the land. It was still harsh. It was still a place where the wind could drive you mad and the sun could kill you. But it was quiet. "I have some money left," she said softly, "from my grandmother's trust. My father couldn't touch that." Caleb stiffened slightly. "Nora, hush," she said gently. "I am not offering to buy you. I am offering to invest." She turned to face him. "I want to be a partner. Caleb, not a silent one. I want to rebuild the barn. I want to bring in better stock. And I want to build a school, just a small one, for the children in town, so they don't have to grow up thinking the only power in the world is a fist or a dollar." Caleb looked at her. He saw the determination in her jaw. He saw the way she looked at the horizon, not with fear, but with ownership. He set his coffee cup down on the railing. He turned to her and took her hands. His right arm was stiff, and the scar on his shoulder would ache when it rained for the rest of his life. But his grip was strong. "I don't have much. Nora," he said, "you have this land." She said, "It's dirt." He said, "You have your hands." She said, "They are scarred, and you have your heart," she whispered. Caleb looked into her eyes. He saw the reflection of the mountains. He saw the future. "I am asking you to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as an investor, not as a partner, but as my wife." He paused, searching for the words. "I can't promise you it will be easy. The wind never stops blowing here. The winters are long. We will work until our backs break. But I promise you, you will never be invisible again. I will see you, Nora, every day, until they put me in the ground." Nora's eyes filled with tears. They spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, a smile breaking through the tears. "It is," he said. "Then I accept." She said, "I have never wanted anything more." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church where Nora had made her confession. It was not a grand affair. There was no organ music, no rows of relatives. Sheriff Miller stood as the witness. Silas, the neighbor, was the best man. Jeb, hobbling on a cane, sat in the front row, grinning through his missing teeth. Some of the townsfolk stayed away. still clinging to their judgment, but many came. They filled the back pews, the blacksmith, the baker, the women who had brought soup. They came because they recognized that what Caleb and Nora had was something rare. It was a love forged in fire and paid for in blood. It was stubborn. It was real. When they walked out of the church doors, the wind caught Nora's veil, whipping it around Caleb's face. They laughed, untangling themselves, and stepped out into the dust of the main street. They didn't look back at the town. They climbed into the wagon and rode west, toward the ranch. The story ends on a night in deep winter. The new barn was finished, smelling of fresh pine and hay. The cattle were bedded down, lowing softly in the dark. The wind brushed the frozen grass in endless, rhythmic waves, a sound like the breathing of the earth itself. Inside the ranch house, the fire was roaring. The room was warm. The bed was no longer divided. The ghost of the past had been laid to rest, not forgotten, but accepted as part of the soil that nourished the present. Caleb and Nora lay together under the heavy quilt. The lamp was turned low. There was no shame here. There was no transaction. There was only the heat of skin on skin, the murmur of voices in the dark, and the profound, settling peace of two people who had fought the world to find each other. Caleb traced the line of Nora's jaw with his thumb. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Nora looked at him. She thought of the silk dresses back in Boston. She thought of the parties, the cold champagne, the hollow compliments. Then she looked at the rough logs of the ceiling, felt the calluses on Caleb's hand, and heard the coyote yipping under the star-thick sky outside. She pressed a kiss to his palm. "I am free," she said, "and I am home." They fell asleep in each other's arms, while outside, the wild, indifferent, beautiful West rolled on, endless and enduring. Thank you for listening to this story. This journey through the dust and desire of the American West has been a privilege to write for you. I hope Caleb and Nora's story resonated with you, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, love can be an act of rebellion and survival. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening or reading from today? What did you think of Nora's choice in the town hall? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. Your support helps keep these campfire stories alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.